as a hush falls over the Assembly. Good evening, everyone. I'm Mayor Patrick Hall. Welcome to the City of Canning's agenda briefing meeting of Tuesday the 9th of March 2021. It's now 6 p.m. and I declare the agenda briefing open. I start by acknowledging the Wadjuk people, the traditional custodians of the land. We also pay our respects, of course, to elders both past and present. Due to COVID restrictions, as you will be well aware, it hasn't been possible to cater for all members of the public to be seated in the function room this evening. Those members of the public who registered their interest in attending the briefing have been allocated seating in the order in which registrations were received. And I understand there may be some people out in the foyer, and I hope that they're able to hear us loud and clear. Members of the public who are located in the foyer are able to hear the audio of the briefing, but unfortunately they may not be able to obviously view the proceedings. Tonight's meeting is for the purpose of asking questions and seeking clarification on agenda items for the next ordinary council meeting, which will be held, of course, next Tuesday evening at this same venue and at the same time. That being the case, no decision making or entering into debate is to occur at this meeting. May I ask everyone present this evening to turn off all electronic devices, that includes mobile phones, iPads and tablets for the duration of the evening, because they do interfere with the recording of this meeting. And tonight's agenda briefing is being recorded, and a copy of the audio recording shall be available on the City's website within 72 hours of the meeting, but I'm pleased to say that often staff get it up very quickly, so appreciative of that. Agenda briefings are public meetings, and any information you provide may be publicly accessible. As far as disclosures of interest, the prescribed disclosure requirements apply to meetings that are convened under the provisions of the Local Government Act. However, it may be perceived as ethically unacceptable or at odds with the probity and accountability principles of the Act and codes of conduct for elected members to participate in forums, briefings or workshops where they are aware they have a conflict of interest and do not declare it. In the interest of openness and accountability, elected members are encouraged to disclose a conflict of interest where they are aware they have one when attending a forum, briefing or workshop, and where applicable, remove themselves from the room while the matter is being discussed. We move on to item 2 of tonight's agenda, which is attendances. We have an apology from Councillor Porter, who is unable to be with us this evening, and also from Councillor Sarah Sabiri, who is also unable to attend tonight's meeting. At item 2.2, approved leave of absence, there are no approved leave of absences. Disclosure of interest. Chief Executive Officer, have we any disclosures of interest?
No, Mayor, none have been received.
That being the case, we'll move on to item 4, question time for the public. We start with item 4.1, which is responses to previous questions taken on notice. Please note that responses to previous questions taken on notice will be noted in the ordinary council meeting agenda for next week. At item 4.2, questions from the public. The time set aside initially for public question time is 15 minutes, and that may be extended if necessary. A question must relate to items listed on tonight's agenda. For recording purposes, please walk up to the lectern here when you're called, state your name and address, and then proceed to ask your question. If an answer cannot be provided at tonight's meeting, the question will be taken on notice and an answer will be provided at the next ordinary council meeting, which will be next Tuesday. In accordance with policy ADO2, members of the public who have... Councillors, can I ask you please to stop talking? Thank you. In accordance with policy ADO2, members of the public who have registered their interest to ask questions with the City's administration shall be called upon in the order in which registrations were received. Written questions will precede verbal questions. I now open public question time at 6:05 p.m. The City has a number of questions for tonight's meeting. The first one will be from Silvio Morricone of 18 Barbican Street. If you'd like to come forward. And just before you do start to speak, good evening, how are you? But just before you do start to speak, I'll just remind everyone present, we've got a number of matters on tonight, one of which the Shelley Beach Master Plan has attracted, considerable community comment. I'll just ask that anybody addressing council tonight just remembers, please to remain calm, speak respectfully, please don't raise your voice, and we too will then listen intently to everything you've got to say. But I just felt it necessary to say that because it's a passionate matter, and some people may find it difficult to, first of all, come to the lectern and address us correctly. So, Mr. Silvio Morricone, please state your name and your address and go ahead.
My name is Silvio Morricone. I live in 18 Barbican Street, Shelley. My question is regarding the Shelly Beach proposition that the council wants to improve the area and put a coffee or restaurant coffee bar there. I believe that a structure of restaurant and coffee bar will spoil the facility. And
can I just say, sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Morricone, tonight is only for asking questions. Tonight is not to actually raise your opinions or speak against the matter, okay, or even for the matter.
Okay.
It's only to ask a question. So if you have a question, you must ask it, and we will certainly try our best to answer it.
Yes. My question is that the Shelley Beach Park should remain as it is. Perhaps the council could improve slightly with extra barbecue sitting or plant, but it's a peaceful area and should stay as it is.
So what is your question?
My question is there should not be any improvement as structure or...
That's not a question, that's a statement.
Well,
have you got a question that you would like council to, well, the city's officers to answer?
Is the council proposing to put a extra facility in that particular area?
Mr. Bowe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, the council is not proposing to build a facility at Shelley Beach Park. The report is simply recommending that council endorse an option for the redevelopment of Shelley Beach Park at some time in the future.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Morricone. Do you have another question? If not, I'll ask Kerry Morricone to come forward. Thank you. If I could ask you to state your name and address.
Hello, my name's Kerry Morricone, 18 Barbican Street West in Shelley for 30 years. My question is, with the development, is the council hoping to bring more people into the area, or is it more to cater for locals? I'm anxious to know.
I'll just ask the director, but I think he made it pretty clear that we're not actually planning at the moment on doing a development. That's not what we're proposing tonight, but certainly I'll ask the director to address that. Director
Sorry.
Bowe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, the park redevelopment proposes to address primarily asset management and asset renewal objectives. Obviously, the equipment and the infrastructure at Shelley Beach Park at the moment is quite dated. Quite simply, our recommendation is that council endorses a master plan for the area and then considers how we fund that over time.
Okay, sorry, we were under the impression, I think, that there was going to be a coffee shop or food outlet there. That was the reason.
Thank you. Richard Aldridge.
Richard Aldridge from 5 Minota Avenue in Shelley. Good afternoon, council. My first question is, other than the location, how will the cafe facility proposed in Plan 3 be substantially different from the cafe facility provided by the Tribute Cafe?
Director Bowe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't believe I can answer that question. I don't believe I've seen any designs or operational proposal for any potential cafe at Shelley Beach Park that would enable me to consider how it compares to the Tribute Street Cafe.
Your second question, Mr. Aldridge.
What unique services will the proposed cafe on Plan 3 provide that are not duplications of the services provided by the Tribute Cafe just 500 metres away?
I'm not certain that I heard a question there. Can I just...
I'll repeat it. What unique services will the proposed cafe on Plan 3 provide that are not duplications of the services already provided by the Tribute Cafe just 500 metres away?
I'm not sure whether the city's officers are in a position. Are you talking about menu items and Is that what you're asking?
Duplication of services.
Director Bowe?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think the answer to Mr Aldridge's first question stands as the answer to the second question.
Mr Aldridge, your final question.
Okay, short preamble. Under the Local Government Act, section 3.183/B, the council must satisfy itself that any services or facilities it intends to provide must not inappropriately duplicate services already provided by a government body. Can I have governance confirm that that's the case?
I'm not certain we'll be able to answer that tonight. I might ask Director Bowe. Beg your pardon? Mr Kane, are you able to respond, or would you rather take the matter on notice?
Look, we take that on notice, Mr Mayor, but I'm not aware of any duplication that would have happened in this particular case, certainly not across government levels.
Thank you, Mr Aldridge. We'll take that question on notice.
Thank you.
Mrs Aldridge?
Good evening, Mr Mayor, councillors, directors and governance staff. My name is Marnie Aldridge and I'm at 5 Minotaur Avenue in Shelley. Just a quick question. With regards to the the RSVP for the meeting next week, I've heard a couple of reports of people having difficulty RSVPing via the computer. Can I get someone please in IT to check? Because a few people have actually mentioned how difficult it was of up to 20 minutes to actually get through to RSVP. They're probably end up RSVPing longer than they are actually at the meeting. So could we ask if someone could please double check, and then the phone as well, to make it an easier process, please, to book.
I'm sure that we could get somebody to check that. Your second question. Thank you.
Could we also move the agenda briefing, the Shelley master plan closer for the members in the gallery?
We propose to be bringing that matter forward. Thank you. Your third question?
And the last question is, how is actually voting process going to be happening to choose the master plans next week? Will you be choosing on master plan 1, 2 or 3, or is it a process of elimination, or how is it actually decided?
It's explained in the report, so the officers have made a recommendation. At the moment, that recommendation is option 2. It's open to council to support option 2 or not support option 2, or pass an amendment and consider another option. That'll be considered on the night.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Next I have, is it Mark Sawyer?
Good evening, Mr Mayor and Council. Mark Sawyer from 341 Riverton Drive in Shelley. My question is to do with the proposal itself. If it is successful and a cafe is proposed and accepted, what's the likely time frame of the actual building? When will it take place?
Director Bowe initially.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The recommendation as it stands seeks the CEO in conjunction with the council to identify funding for the delivery of the project during 2021-2022. It will be up to the council to allocate sufficient funds as to whether the full scope of the project or whether a staged approach to deliver various elements of the master plan can be achieved over a period of time.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming along, Mr Sawyer. Mr Kevin Stevenson, would you like to step forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor and CEO, councillors and City of Canning staff. Yes, my question is, particularly with regards to option 3, what provisions have been made in the budget for preparing submissions to state ministers for approval and for preparing the business plan proposals for those options?
Director Bowe.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. In the 2020-2021 budget, there are no provisions to make any application to any of the state government departments, simply because this council hasn't resolved a particular preference for any of the options to redevelop the master plan. So there are no funds in this current financial year, hence the recommendation is to identify funding in the next financial year to enable the delivery of the project.
Thank you, Mr Bowe.
Thank you, Mr Stevenson. Madeline Inslee, I apologise if I've got your surname wrong. Madeline?
Yes, I'm Madeline Inslee of Riverton Drive, Shelley. Mine's a related question on the financing of the proposed cafe under option 3. I attended a number of the briefing meetings, and it was quite evident that all people, regardless of which option they favoured, were not in favour of a large franchisee running the cafe. I refer to the financials in this briefing paper, and my question is, in light of the city's stretched finances, what options for funding and ongoing costs are to be explored? And will the city be lured by the temptation of arrangements with large corporate franchisees?
Thank you, Mrs. Inslee. I don't think we've ever considered a large commercial franchise. I think, are you talking about something of like Dome in, is that what you're talking about?
You named it, but yes.
Yeah, I think that's
that's
the misinformation, unfortunately, that's been passed around the community. That has never been mooted by council, I think, and Director Bowe will answer the question, but I think the proposal in 3 and the publicly released documents have a map and plan that actually shows you the footprint. I don't think the footprint that is proposed for a cafe is really any, well, I think it's the same size as Low Key at Riverton Bridge. So it's not much bigger than the toilet block that is there now, which it would replace. So the information about this large commercial dome has never been proposed, as far as I know.
I wasn't picking up on rumours.
Yeah, that's okay.
Because last year I attended a council meeting where it wasn't clear that you were excluding.
Okay, let's make it crystal clear tonight. Director Bowe, could you just answer that question from Mrs. Inslee, please?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. You are correct in a number of the things that you said. However, the footprint that is identified in option 3, any development of a cafe and the operation of a cafe there, the city would be bound by the Local Government Act in its disposition of the rights to operate that cafe on that particular site. Any expression of interest or request for proposal or even a tender would then need to follow a statutory process. It would then be referred back to the council to make a decision.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Inslee, do you have a second question?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. If option 2 is progressed, please will council consider contractual clauses to ensure products for dispensing drinks and food are environmentally sustainable and not plastic, and that all litter sourced from the van or whatever it will be cleared at least daily.
Director Bowe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We certainly have requirements for city-operated events from a sustainability angle in relation to the operation of any space that is made available for food trucks or food vans or coffee vans, as is the current recommendation.
Sarah, can you just... We've asked too many questions. We've worn out.
The operating requirements and how that space functions will be determined at that particular time. We're already engaging with other local government authorities. We aren't the only ones to offer a space for itinerant food vans and other vendors to attend, but certainly the cleanliness and the maintenance of that area is going to be paramount for our operational staff if we spend over $3 million redeveloping that park.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for coming along this evening. Colin McKeating.
Oh, sorry. Apologies, I'm just going to do a deputation, not a question. Thank you.
You're not asking any questions?
No.
Okay. Does our staff aware that you're doing a deputation this evening? Oh, it is. Yeah, got it. Thank you. We'll write you off just write you off here. Yes, we do have you listed for a deputation. Thank you. I have a name here that I'm finding a little bit difficult to read. Deal with it once Gemma Sandwich? No? Sorry, Grecian, I couldn't read the writing. That's obviously you. No?
Yes, it's an incorrect entry there.
Thank you. We won't pick that up on the recording, but just for the sake of the recording, you're saying that it's incorrectly listed and you're not wanting to ask a question. Okay, thank you. Murray Redderstock, I see you there in the front row. Please come forward.
Good evening, Mr Mayor and councillors. I live at 223 Riverton Drive, and my name's Murray Redderstock. My issues relate to, one, parking. There are significant issues for residents with parking at Low Key and Deepwater, where, from what I understand, the overflow parking will go now into the surrounding 6 residential blocks near Deepwater. With option 3, can the council give an assurance that any parking supplementary to the tabled plans will not eventually lead to the development and paving of the current event parking area east of the toilet block, thereby drastically reducing the open space and amenity or purpose of the park?
Director Bowe. And I note again that you've mentioned the huge dome on at Deepwater Point. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
I think that has seating for a couple of hundred people, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, they've had some review or some sort of analysis.
Director Bowe?
I'll answer the latter part of your question first, Mr Radderstock, which I understood pertained to seeking an assurance that the open space area, the current turfed area, would not be paved to accommodate parking.
Yeah.
Well, I can only go on the options that have been developed, and that will be endorsed by, or that may be endorsed by Council next week. There is no intention to formalise parking on the Shelley Beach Park in the area that's currently used for overflow parking for the odd event that happens there across the year. In relation to the expansion of car parking into the residential areas, again, we're aware that that does occur from time to time in and around Shelley Beach Park for special events. We're aware that it occurs from time to time adjacent to Low Key Cafe and other commercial establishments and other popular recreational parks, and adjacent to Carousel during December. The city cannot cater for parking for every large event that happens throughout the city. There will be events for which the parking demand exceeds the supply, and for that we will manage that on a case-by-case basis.
Yep, fair enough. Okay, the 90-degree parking, in order to accommodate 90-degree parking, is there any further increase or planned increase in the resumption of the main road reserve and hence parkland above what's already planned for the cafe option?
Director Bowe.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The 90-degree parking that is represented on all 3 options does slightly encroach already into the parkland area, but that is specifically to enable a safer access and egress into those 90-degree bays. There are also additional traffic calming measures at either end of Riverton Drive, adjacent to Shelley Beach Park, which aims to slow the traffic, and we believe, and our traffic engineers believe, that the outcome is a safer outcome, notwithstanding that there are people who think that 45-degree angle parking is a better option. We believe that creating a greater space to access and egress the 90-degree bays is a better outcome.
And is there any plan or possible plan to have a median strip in the middle, or take on the verge on the other side of the residential area?
Thanks, Mr Radderstock. So that'll be your final question, and just for the record, we're a couple of minutes over time, but I'm happy to extend if anybody else has a question, but if not, I'll ask the Director to
No, there's no plans to encroach into the adjacent or the verge opposite at this point in time, and none of that is not reflected on either of the options.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr Radderstock. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question before we close public question time? Thank you. We'll close public question time now at exactly 6:25 p.m. Thank you very much. We move on to item 4.3, which is deputations. A deputation has been approved by Mr Arnold Newmumba. Arnold, would you like to come forward? Mr Newmumba, you have 10 minutes in which to make your maximum of 10 minutes in which to make your deputation. So please just state your name and what you'd like to speak about, and then go right ahead.
Thank you very much, Mayor. My last name is Nyamamba. Good evening to you all councillors and everyone else present. My address is Unit 5 of 24 to 26 Marjorie Avenue in Shelley. My deputation is to agree to the staff recommendation relating to the draft Access and Inclusion Policy AD.C8. I agree on behalf of the Access and Inclusion Advisory Group for the following reasons. The diversity in our group had thought leaders in culturally and linguistically diverse, disability, and a diverse cross-section of groups representative of the City of Canning. The lived experiences of my fellow advisory group members made the policy co-design process engaging, interesting, and more importantly, fulfilling. The advisory group meticulously combed through the policy in its entirety, acknowledging our mandate was to advise the city on contemporary access and inclusion matters, whilst taking note of the inclusion solutions recommendations. The co-design workshops were robust, thorough, and well thought out to encourage contribution from all advisory group members. Diving deep into words that were reflective of the sentiments and the lived experiences of some of the members was quite critical. I wish we had brought a thesaurus in some of the core design workshops. Multiple lived examples were raised by some of our advisory group members who reside within the city, articulating accessibility challenges they have encountered, and it is quite refreshing to note that the draft policy is quite succinct and comprehensive to address these matters. In conclusion, it is encouraging to note some of my key advisory group members, Zell and Feliz, are in attendance to assist me in answering some of the questions you may have for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming along this evening. I very much appreciate it. I'm also advised that a number of members of the City of Canning's Access and Inclusion Advisory Group are actually here tonight. So I'm really pleased to welcome you to the City of Canning and to this meeting on behalf of Council. I will be proposing to bring that matter forward first. So please sit back and we'll get to that as soon as we possibly can.
Thank you.
Thank you once again. I'd like to call forward Mr. Kevin Stevenson regarding item EN 00121, the Shelley Beach Master Plan. Mr. Stevenson, you also have, of course, up to 10 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Hall. And again, councillors. So regards the Shelley Beach Park Master Plan, so in reviewing the papers for the agenda and for the council meetings, and particularly with reference to option 3, it introduces unnecessary complexity, time and cost to prepare a business proposal and, more importantly, to gain the needed state ministerial approvals. It's not clear what provisions have been made in the costings to prepare the documentation, and the estimated durations appear to be for a trouble-free approvals by the ministers. Given the opposition for a cafe, it would be reasonable to expect submissions opposing the cafe to be made for ministerial consideration, adding to the duration, the uncertainty and the cost for this option. More importantly, there's a notable omission from the legal considerations. The inclusion of a cafe introduces several torts, such as noise, nuisance, and impact on property values. Local residents would be within their legal right to sue the council and seek compensation and/or forced closure of such cafe. Class action is a real risk that councils need to carefully consider. All the reports, council minutes, news articles, social media posts, Mr. Mayor, would come under the scrutiny of the courts, and legal compensation costs to the City of Canning and its ratepayers exceeding $10 million is quite a plausible outcome. So there's no information that such risk has been given thought, and to make an informed, objective, balanced decision, Council needs to give due consideration to such risk. Thank you, Mayor Hall.
Thanks, Mr Stevenson. Thank you for coming along. I'd like to now call forward Mr Pat Coffey regarding the same item, EN 001 of 21, the Shelley Beach Park Master Plan. Mr Coffey, can I just get you to state your name and your address, and then please go ahead.
Good evening all. My name's Pat Coffey, 3A Tribute Street in Shelley. For the past 12 years we've lived on Tribute Street, about 200 metres from the Shelley Beach foreshore, one of the most beautiful stretches of the Canning River. We've walked our dogs on the foreshore pretty well every day, but for the last 12 years we've had to endure a very tired park, an extremely tired kids playground, one in need of a complete rebuild, one that caters for all ages and all abilities, and one with shade. For 12 years we've been taking our grandchildren to the playground for the same few boring bits of play equipment, and I must say almost each month there seems to be something broken that requires sections to be fenced off. Sometimes the whole playground is fenced off. Every time this development of the Shelley Beach comes up, it becomes the most emotional subject in, I'd say, the city. Every time there's any suggestion of improvements, minority groups come out of the woodwork. There's scaremongering about the loss of a dog beach. The cafe bigger than Dome at Deepwater Point keeps coming up. Of course, the parking issues come up. Petitions are pushed seeking signatures from just about anyone with a pulse. Every hurdle imaginable. It is very emotional. 4 years ago, the city conducted a formal survey of the residents of Shelley and Rossmoyne. In terms of the household that responded, the responses was extremely strong. 67% of those who responded stated they wanted the park to be developed and they were happy for the consideration of a cafe. About 30% objected. The survey followed with a number of workshops where everyone had the chance to participate in the end result. Then further phone feedback was invited. I attended a council meeting where one of the city ratepayers stood up and he stated that he'd made hundreds of calls to that phone number to ensure the phone survey was skewed and worthless. That little exercise would have cost the city quite a tidy sum, only to see it scuttled by a self-serving individual. Any councillor who secured 67% of the vote in their particular ward election would be pretty pleased with that result. Councillors are elected to look after their electorate. 67% have told you loud and clear what they want. Do we run with the 67%, or do we take the path of least resistance and let the 30% win the day and do very little? The majority have made their preferences clear. Now the councillors need to grant them their wish. To do no more than a few token gestures will mean the last 4 years of surveys, phone feedback, workshops have all been for nothing. Bannister Ward is very fortunate to have two extremely hard-working and passionate councillors. I do hope you will listen to what they tell you that their electorate is telling them. I leave it in your capable hands, and thanks for the opportunity to express my thoughts.
Thank you, Mr Coffey. I now call forward Ms Colma Keating. Colma. Colma will be doing a deputation in relation to the same item, Shelley Beach Park Master Plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Colma Keating, 187B Riverton Drive in Shelley. Good evening and thank you all. In addition to being a relatively long-term City of Canning resident, almost 30 years, during which time I have been a very active urban land care volunteer along the Shelley-Rossmoyne foreshore, I am a botanist and a geographer by training and career. This included carrying out flora and vegetation surveys, rehabilitation plans, rehabilitation site works, monitoring and evaluation, comparative studies of flora and vegetation assessment, and training others. Whilst you don't need me to tell you that Shelley Beach Park has very high value for its natural, reclaimed and rehabilitated aspects, I will of course take this opportunity to refresh us all a little. Our city, the Swan River Trust, the Canning River Residents Protection Association, Creeper, the Wadjup Gabalju Group have contributed significantly to the improved health and environmental value of the Shelley-Rossmoyne foreshore, as well as the improved and ongoing understanding of this area. Why didn't I bring some photos to demonstrate it? Our city and these groups have done this with many others, including our local primary and secondary schools, scouts, guides, lions, clubs, TAFEs, universities and corporate organisations such as the RAC and Woodside. They have also done this with the financial investment of all spheres of government along with corporate and private philanthropy. While Shelley Beach Park's purpose includes passive recreation, which is fabulous and much needed, the master plan, as per the master plan, we are able to continue to improve the environmental aspects with planting design and plant choice, not just for this immediate parkland, but for the ecological linkages as well, obviously contributing to the implementation of our city's strategies for urban forests, biodiversity and climate change mitigation, to name a few. The natural elements also provide park users with protection and enjoyment. All your research on the well-being of our city's residents, workers and visitors will already be informing you of how critical the natural environment is for improving physical and mental well-being. Whiteman Park in the city of Swan and Joolabup Shenton Lake in the city of Subiaco provide two other great examples of how increasing the tree and understory cover in parkland areas provides for both the native inhabitants and Homo sapiens. To also provide an indication of how important mature gum and paperbark trees are for our native geckos, a few years ago when a single humble mature flooded gum needed to be removed from beside the dual-use path, creeper volunteers caught and relocated 47 geckos to surrounding trees, and these were just from the bark of the lower branches that we could reach. We can be most encouraged that the downstream boundary of Shelley Beach Park at Grecian Spit, where the Beatrice Avenue main drain empties into the river, has been much improved over the decades with plantings and with the recent living stream works at Nerdy Park, and with the fencing to protect both the vegetation as well as the resting, feeding and nesting birds. In addition, the Wadjup Gabbaldoo sign helps to engage, inform and educate passers-by about the importance of our local neighbourhood nature. For the foreshore strip from Yagan to Shelley Bridge, the local urban landcare group Creeper has recorded 81 native and several bird species since 1991. As a comparison, Kings Park's 400 hectares of native vegetation, parks and gardens record 80 bird species. Along the rest of the Lower Canning foreshore in our city, we need to continue to manage the buffering sedgelands that also protect the river edge from erosion, to increase the understory and tree canopy as mentioned earlier, and replace the nesting trees and shrubs before they die. As you know, we are so lucky to have the Lower Canning and its foreshore as part of our city. We are so lucky to be able to enjoy the riverside park of Shelley Beach. We are so lucky to be able to incorporate neighbourhood nature in our recreation spaces. We have a responsibility to ensure we incorporate and manage the best natural environment we can. Best wishes with your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Final deputation tonight is from Mrs. Marnie Aldridge. Mrs. Aldridge.
It's been a little while since I've done this. Stacey, do you have a clicker? Or
I beg your pardon? I'll just ask staff to assist Mrs. Aldridge, please.
Sorry, maybe I'm not seeing it very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Aldridge. Go ahead.
Okay, good evening, Mr Mayor, CEO Kyron, councillors, directors of City of Canning, governance and those in the public gallery. My deputation tonight will be about behaviour safe feedback results from the Shelley Beach Master Plan. Firstly, I'd like to say I'm really pleased that our community was given the opportunity to provide feedback, and here is my feedback on the feedback. Okay, so I hope I'm doing this right, isn't I? Okay. First of all, I'd just like to point out, before the feedback was actually undertaken, originally the Painted Dog survey was for Rossmoyne and Shelley residents only. However, this feedback was provided to the whole of the City of Canning, which was very different to the Painted Dog, which was only restricted to Rossmoyne and Shelley. Also, it was to be noted that no registration was needed during this feedback session. They had no proof of residency, so you could be, as we found out from Thornley, Jandakot, also from Midland. We have even had someone from Exmouth try to put in their say as well. So we actually had quite a few problems with trying to find out who was actually giving true and good feedback for the relevance of this project. Now, another thing to consider is the feedback is not necessarily exact, of course. The feedback results, yes, there were duplications, and the comments has everything, and the tabulations are not 100% accurate, but that's the process. But it does provide councillors the opportunity to hear what the residents are feeling about the project. Okay. There were about 930 have your say feedback comments. We decided when we were tabulating, Rich and I, that there was about anything that was over 3, multiple feedback, and there was quite a few. From the single IP addresses, they were discounted. If there were 2 feedbacks from the same device, we just assumed it would be a couple, like my parents. They have the one computer between the 2 of them. And where dual options, if they didn't mind us saying option 2 or option 3, we gave a 0.5 for each. Feedback from outside the City of Canning, we decided we weren't going to count because we wanted City of Canning relevance. And we tabulated the number of comments from each of the suburbs, and that was also very interesting to see which suburbs were also commenting. Oh, sorry, that's a bit small on the screen. First of all, I wanted to say thank you very much to the City of Canning for ensuring that all multiple feedback was removed. It made it a more genuine and or accurate reflection of the community. Also, thank you to AHA Consulting, who also filtered and tabulated all the information, because I know originally it wasn't going to be tabulated. So that was also a great undertaking for them to do. So I really appreciate that they went through that. We also had a go at tabulating some of the results and some of the information and the discoveries. Where there were lots of passionate comments from both sides. And of course the usual comments that they come in about, oh, we don't want to share. There's also, you're spoiling it for everyone, and all those other comments of stop spreading misinformation. But if you really look at the feedback, and I have to admit, even at the beginning, it was lots of cafe please, and I thought, oh, okay, this is what everyone's hoping for. But if you continue reading through, a lot more people are also having different says. I'm sorry, but these continual claims of we are a vocal minority, we are a vocal majority. And you can see this as well. It has been years since this has been taken, and of course with that we had COVID. Now, Shelley Beach Park has never been used as much as it has been now. And I'm sure if we actually did the survey now, the results even would be different again. Feedback by suburb. So, first of all, you can see that Shelley was about 47% of the respondents. We also had Rossmoyne about 17, Riverton about 8.7, Willerton, and Wilson 3.5. Wilson also, very interestingly, wanted a cafe because they wanted the pressure off the low-key cafe. So they're realising low-key is so popular, shove it your way to Shelley, that would be great for us. Other City of Canning suburbs and outside the City of Canning, there's about 3%. Since the initial Painted Dog survey, which was Shelley and Rossmoyne, there's been a significant drop in support for a permanent cafe. Now, yes, it's right, it was 4 years ago when that original survey was done. However, there was no concept plans, there was no talk about traffic, the implications of parking. So in the Painted Dog survey, which was Rossmoyne and Shelley, you're looking at about 68, I can't read that with my glasses, and 34 for no. And if you're actually looking at what people were actually strongly against is the permanent cafe structure, the cafe did in fact drop support to about 44. Now, cafes, of course, a popular decision for people who were further away from the park. Wilson, about 94 comments, about 70%, Willerton. People in Willerton were very keen to have a cafe. They don't actually have to be potentially affected by the negative impacts of traffic and parking, so of course they're happy for it. So really, the Shelley feedback sort of fell into pretty much thirds, but as you can see, coffee were ahead, and yes, if you wanted to look at that, that's 42. But if you notice in Plan 1 it's 38, it is closer, and it is very close between them. Plan 2 also had some feedback about 19%. So once again, if you actually look at the statistics, you're looking at Plan 3, it's for a cafe, but if you're also looking at the Plan 1 and Plan 2, which are actually offering a coffee option or no option, it's also ahead. To consider, the feedback results were based on the current Master Plan 3 design with only 56 car parking bays. Now, if Master Plan 3 had shown the cafe as what it is currently in the low key, which needs 110 bays, then we believe the cafe option may have been even more unpopular. Many might have been keen for a cafe, but unaware of just how much parking it will require. That is a picture of low key, not of the Shelley Beach. Council also need to consider what residents are opposed to as well as resident support, and this is what AHA also collated. Opposition against the options. There was about 11% who were opposed to option 1, about 23 opposed to option 2, and about 64% opposed to the cafe. Now, when you consider the opposition and support for each of the master plans in Shelley, you get the following results. Option 1, there is that support of 54.9, option 2, and then, of course, option 3. Sorry, option 3 is a 12. Now, why care about Shelley residents? Well, Shelley only has really one park. As we know, we've got the Shelley Park, which is used for sport and also for dogs as well. But really, this is our one and only public open space. Even though the tennis club is actually stated as public open space, it's neither public nor open. You have to be a member. So really, when you look at that plan there, we do not have very much open public space. So that's why we are fiercely protective. We have less public open space, disposing of our public space through leasing the park with a commercial enterprise. Now, we know for sure, yes, it might not even be a dome, but there was no guarantees to the tribute either. There's no guarantees to what that tender process will say. So sure, we can have a specific type of tender process. It could be a dome, could be the tribute. I'd love it. If it was the tribute, it would be great. It would be someone for the community. But there are no guarantees what it will be. Shelley residents will lose even more of the public open space due to the commercial coffee shop parking requirements. Now, parking is the biggest issue. We have a problem with the parking, and also those master plan 3s are not showing the whole amount. Shelley Beach Park has already been heavily used, and still is, used by families for the whole of the City of Canning, having picnics, barbecues, and a whole lot of other variety of park users. And of course, with COVID, it was getting quite busy out there sometimes. Now, we don't really need to activate what is already a very busy park. We need to improve the amenities, we totally agree with that, to provide better services than what it's already used for. More barbecues, gazebos, benches, toilets, more shade. The toilets, not toilets, the tables and chairs down at Kent Street look amazing. We've got the barbecue nearby. We would love something like that at Shelley. But what everyone could agree on, there were many things that all three different groups agreed on that the improvements did need to be made, as it's been too long and the park does need an update. That we need more shade, table seating and chairs, benches, barbecues and more picnic areas. But most importantly, and this did come through in the survey, we need a really good new playground. So let's consider doing the improvements that most people agree on rather than splitting the community by building a permanent cafe. If you feel this area needs to be more activated, then please consider putting in the effort and the resources to provide a fantastic playground. Now, I've talked about playgrounds before. I'm also concerned about all three master plans having a small, similar size playground. I'd love to see that improved, bigger, better. We have the potential for an awesome
40
playground.
seconds, Mrs.
Okay, I'll go really quick. And so I don't envy you making these decisions, councillors. It is going to be hard. You're not going to please everyone. I really hope that you can make the best decision for a majority of the people, also thinking of the children. I know it sounds a bit corny, but this playground, we have the potential to do something amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's the final approved deputation for this evening. Time now is, was it 6:50 on the dot. We'll move to item 5, which is items brought forward for the convenience of those people in the public. I would like to advise that I intend to bring forward 2 items, the first of which will be CO 001 of 21. That's the adoption of policy AD 08, access and inclusion. I'll then be bringing forward the Shelley Beach Master Plan item. Councillors, therefore, we will move to CC 002 of 21. The responsible officer is Dr. Sarah McQuaid, to my left, the Director of Canning Community. The title of that item is the adoption of policy AD 08, access and inclusion. Councillors, do I have any questions from the floor? If there are no questions, we'll move on. Thank you, councillors. There are no questions. We'll move to item EN 001 of 21, the responsible officer being Director Warren Bowe, the Director of Canning Environment. The title of the report being Shelley Beach Master Plan, 3 options, community feedback. The officer's recommendation is on page 129 of tonight's agenda and should be and is on screen. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Spencer, to you.
Sorry, I've got rather a large list here, but I'll try and get through them quickly. Would either of the 3 options attract any form of state funding?
Director Bowe.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. None that readily springs to mind, Councillor Spencer-Teo. Certainly our initiatives and actions in the area along the Shelley Rossmoyne foreshore aim to promote and partner with volunteer groups to obtain external grant funding. But nothing necessarily springs to mind. Certainly, any commercial activity on that site would not be the subject of any external funding, as we would understand it.
Thank you. Would it be commercially reasonable to make a condition of the lease, if it was option 2 or 3, to ban plastics or takeaway containers or anything like that as part of the lease?
Director, is that possible?
I think that's possible, Mr Mayor. We already have sustainability practices that apply to city events. That could be something that could be incorporated into any commercial agreement. Obviously, that would be at a particular cost to the outcome of that commercial agreement, I'd expect.
Thank
Councillor?
you. Just a question that I asked last week that most of them got answered, but this one didn't. I just checking up. The petition for the cafe that was received in 2018, I still can't find anywhere that tells me how many people signed that petition. Would
Director?
you have that? I'll take that on notice.
I'm happy to take that on notice, Mr Mayor.
Councillor
Thank you.
Spencer-Teo?
And with respect to the survey results, I note there was 47,410, for lack of a better word, bogus entries in there. According to the report, these are obviously not only given a user ID but also an IP address. Would it be reasonable to say that the city knows who those 47,410 entries were from, given that we would somewhere have the IP address?
Director, is that true? Did we have 47,000 fake responses?
I believe it was in that order, Mr Mayor. Yes, and I do not know, as the representative of the city, who that IP address is, and it would not be in our interest to ascertain and certainly divulge that publicly. No.
But if
Councillor Spencer-Teo?
the people who did that survey would obviously have that information, not that I'm asking for it, but it is, the IP address is registered.
Mr Johnson?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. No, the IP address isn't registered. The unique user ID is applied to someone who's got into the system, and it records their unique user ID for 30 minutes, so they can go in a number of times during that 30 minutes, but there's no logging of IP address. So the software owner and the city don't know anyone's details.
Thank you. I've just got a number of questions myself before we go, and I'll come back. Oh, sorry, Councillor Spencer-Teo, I've cut you off. Go ahead.
Sorry. Just understanding the makeup and ethos behind Creek and Low Key. Could someone just give me a brief summary of their ownership? For example, I believe they're on leases. Did the city pay for the build and fit off of those cafes, or were they done by the owner-operators? Just a very short summary just to help me clarify.
Are you able to answer that without taking the matter on notice? Director?
I think I'd prefer to take that on notice, Mr Mayor, and provide a full response to the councillor. Thanks.
Thank you. My only questions were just following on from Councillor Spencer-Teo's comments. Yes, there were a number of petitions, both for and against, provided, and just as far as democracy goes and also accountability and transparency, I do see reference in the timeline to one of the petitions, but it doesn't actually provide any detail to council, and I think I'd really like to see that, and I don't understand why it's not in there. Can I ask for a comment on that?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. If your question is, can we include a bit more detail surrounding the two petitions, the answer is yes, I'll address that and provide that after or for the OCM.
The only other question was just in relation to page 129 of tonight's agenda, where it actually has a brief overview of the history of the matter. It starts with the paragraph in brief and talks about an ordinary council meeting at on the 18th of October 2016, and I think it makes the assertion that that's when this matter was actually first raised. I draw the city's attention to the fact that the matter was actually first raised by the Rossmoyne, Riverton, Shelley Ratepayers Association at an annual general meeting of that year in early 2016. A motion was put, and I know that these motions aren't binding, but a motion was put by the residents' peak body, their representative body, to consider some enhancement, and I think it was potential consideration for a cafe at that location. I'm wondering why that hasn't been referenced anywhere in the report, and whether that will be included for the OCM, just for fullness of the record.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. You are correct, that has been omitted from the report. I understand that in 2016 at that general meeting of electors there was a motion put by the Ratepayers Association, and that resolution was subsequently considered by Council in February 2016. I will obtain a copy of that resolution. As I understand it, it simply was that Council noted the resolution from the general meeting of electors, but I will ensure that the report is updated to reflect that for the OCM, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Bowe. Councillor Ponaturo, and then I'll come back to Councillor Barry. Councillor Ponaturo.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Given that option 1 and 2 between the CapEx and OpEx is not much of a difference, but also given that also the dollar value is fairly high, 3 million, 2.9 million. So my question, just for the public interest and everybody's interest, is to Director Bowe or to his team. Looking at the option 1, out of there are 4 steps involved in the foreshore, playground, picnic and barbecue areas, and public art. So perhaps if you have a better breakdown, whatever it is the priority, perhaps the playground is the priority, if that's what we hear. And if we can know the cost of it, maybe that will help us to go through the budget process next week, which we are starting hopefully very soon. So maybe Director Bowe, thank you so much. Through Mr Mayor, thank you.
I'm not sure if was there a question.
The question is, out of the 4 steps, there are 4 parts involved in the option 1. So can we have a breakdown on each of that, instead of just having a
Director
total?
Bowe, is that a possibility?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, we can do that, Councillor Ponaturo. Also, I guess as part of the budget considerations, subject to a resolution next week which supports an option, we would put forward, the administration would put forward that a staged approach to delivering whichever option Council resolves to proceed with would be the best plan of attack, so we can break down those various elements, provide a bit more detail regarding the aggregated cost of those stages for consideration by Council as part of the budget.
Councillor Ponaturo.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So if we have the value breakdown for each of the 4 parts, which will be handy to make a decision next week. Also, is there provision, for example, if we decided the playground is needed and if we go with that, and then later on can we add, would we able to leave a provision to build the picnic and barbecues area probably in 2 years' time or something? Maybe it's not necessary now, it might become necessary to the people later on. So can we leave the provision to build that later as well, or it doesn't occur any other capital cost for that? Thank you.
Director, given our deficit position at the moment, I think Councillor Ponaturo is asking whether or not we can stage these works. Is that what is being proposed? Or what would be proposed?
Yes, Mr Mayor. The recommendation as it stands at the moment, whilst it might not be entirely clear, it does seek Council to consider and allocate funding in next year's budget, primarily to bring forward the playground renewal, the accessibility upgrades and some minor other infrastructure as part of a staged approach.
Thank you. Councillor Barry. Sorry, I missed you earlier.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just in relation to what was, and a couple of my questions have already been answered, so that's pretty good. Just in relation to what Councillor Ponaturo was saying then about, and we're saying we would stage it is it possible that, given this is the only AB, that, and given you saying that that's what we would do, that that could form part of the recommendation for 1, 2 or 3, whichever one is chosen, that we go down that path of, we can, if somebody moves, maybe the playground be done and the rest be staged over a number of years. Once again, as the Mayor has just pointed out, our operational deficit and what we're going to be reading in CC 008-21 in a short time. Is that a possible scenario that can be achieved?
Director, that would be the intent.
Yeah, that's the intent, and that's how I read Part 3 of the recommendation, to effectively bundle together the playground, shade and accessibility improvements as a stage 1. But I take the councillor's point, it could possibly be made clearer. But it certainly was the intention of the administration when this matter and the full delivery of the $3 million park redevelopment project was considered by council during the budget workshops, that further consideration to the staging and the timing of those stages could be done at that time.
That's a yes. Yep.
Okay.
Councillor Burry.
I'll take that as a yes. Just in relation to the living stream, as I read it, it basically says that as a living stream, I think it says it acknowledges the ability to operate as a high-functioning living stream will be compromised. So I assume by that we won't do it and there is an alternate. But what would be the cost saving in that? Because I assume that in the different options that contain the living stream, there must have been some money apportioned to that. So what was the cost of that? What will we save, and what will we possibly be looking at, if that's not too much to ask?
Sorry, Director Vo.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Certainly, my colleague Mr. Johnson is looking for the estimate cost. If we had our time again, we'd probably remove the reference to the living stream. It was certainly a concept that we supported. In effect, it's daylighting the drain. Doing some plantings in and around the daylighting of the drain, highlighting to the visitors to the park what can be achieved through some first flush nutrient attenuation. But we have made it clear ever since the query was raised about whether we could achieve a living stream or not, that we couldn't. But the concept and trying to improve the drainage and the quality of the water that discharges into the river is still going to be progressed as part of the plan, and I'm not sure whether Mr. Johnson's found a cost. What we can do is we have the quantity surveyor's opinion of probable cost. We can extract that out and provide that information into the report and to the elected members before the OCM.
That'll be in the report, Councillor Barry. Anything else? Thank you. Councillor Kunze.
Further to that question and the answer provided, I guess throughout this process people have wanted specific answers, and I guess I just want to clarify the fact that as we go to detailed design, there might be some aspects that are cost prohibitive or they're not worth if they don't meet the functional requirements or the community expectation. And so the city, whilst progressing this through stages, will look at what the community want up front, but also a lot of the questions even asked tonight won't be answered until we get into that detailed design.
Director?
That's correct, Councillor Kunze.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kunze, next question.
Yep, just with respect to 27A and 27B within the report and the questions asked before about the thousands of responses. I know the director missed the last electors meeting. I just wanted to confirm that he was aware that an individual actually self-reported to openly stating that he had deliberately compromised the integrity of the survey process by submitting thousands and thousands of responses.
Well, that's disappointing to hear. Director, are you aware of an individual self-reporting that he had been responsible for hundreds, if not thousands, of false survey responses?
I was aware, Mr. Mayor, yes, but I think the less commentary surrounding individuals who chose to disregard and disrespect the city's attempts at engagement on this project would be the better part of valour.
Councillor Kunze.
And just lastly, with respect to the comments before about potential legal issues, given that it's in the development control area, in the Swan Canning development control area, is Low Key not in the same development control area as what's Shelley Beach Park is? And if so, have there been any legal issues or any similar sort of issues similar to what has been potentially identified?
Director Bowe. Oh, Dion Johnson, please. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, both are within the development control area, and no, I'm unaware of any legal issues attributed to Low Key Cafe.
Deputy Mayor Jessie Jacobs. Oh, I thought you had your hand up. Any other Councillor Spencer Teo?
How much did the city invest in all of this consulting and, the word's completely gone out of my head. That's the word I was looking for, survey results. Thank you.
Director, can we quantify that? Dion Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Since 2017-18, we have spent $120,000.
Councillor?
With the latest survey, did we get charged per survey received?
Response received? Mr. Johnson?
No, not at all.
Thank you. Councillor Ponatero?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question. It can be fairly a basic question I'm going to ask again. It's been made that one particular IP address had made a number of attempts to make the survey results or the comments. So if we are unable to prove that the evidence, are we just speaking about allegations, or are we able to prove that? Or is that the priority now, or is it the priority for us to be focusing on making a decision on behalf of our people of Canning? Thank you.
Director?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll draw the councillor's attention to attachment 7, which clearly identifies those individuals or an individual who chose to make multiple submissions on the city's Your Say page. The information is there in black and white. How the elected members choose to regard it, or to what credence they give the submissions made there are a number of people who made multiple entries. It's up to council to consider how much weight they give those submissions.
Councillor Ponatero?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think just before this survey went out, I think I made a question because everyone pays rate here in City of Canning. If we wanted specifically a City of Canning ratepayers to be answering, whether we could have given them a unique ID, a primary ID number, so then we could have actually controlled that to this happening. So do you think that's something we could look at that in future surveys that should improve? Thank you.
I think we'll note that comment. It's probably not relevant tonight, but thanks for raising it. It has been raised previously. Yep. Thank you. Any other questions, Councillor? Councillor Bain?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple of questions for myself.
Go ahead.
Regardless of which option the city endorses, can the city confirm that there will be more bike racks made available at Shelley Beach Park?
I certainly hope so, Councillor Bain. Director? Or Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, we hope so too. Absolutely.
And should council endorse option 2, can the city confirm the frequency of the food vans / food trucks? Would that be on an ad hoc basis? Thank you.
Mr. Johnson or Director Bowe?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, we can't confirm the frequency. We can't confirm the operating requirements or the operating methodology, or how we would open access to that space up to the market as yet. There is some thought being given to it, and as I said earlier, we're engaging with other local governments. But no, I can't give any certainty about how that will operate, Councillor Bain.
Nothing further. Thank you very much, councillors. We shall... Oh, sorry, Councillor Holland. Forgive me. What happened there? I didn't see your hands waving. Councillor Holland.
I've just got a follow-up question. If we do consider banning takeaway containers and so forth, how would you actually have a food van work? As far as I could see, it'd be an impossibility.
I'm not sure we would know that at this point, Director.
I don't think we were looking at banning takeaway containers. I think we were looking at banning plastic and single-use plastic containers that may or not be used for takeaway food, but certainly there are other ways in which food can be served besides single-use plastic these days, and that was probably what I understood the line of the question to be.
Single-use plastics like water bottles.
Yeah. Have we thought of the safety concerns of the open drain? There's a lot of kids play down there. It's an open, it's going to be sloped in, there's going to be nothing around it. What are we going to do to mitigate that?
Director.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. The detailed design would take into consideration the safety aspects. Certainly, there's a significant other body of water in and around Shelley Beach Park that poses similar risk to young kids as well. But certainly, the drain would be designed to prevent those types of issues.
Thank you.
The
Yes,
last
Councillor.
one, yeah. Going on from Councillor Berry's question on number 3, I'd actually ask that it is more specific.
We're talking about the officer's recommendation number 3. You'd prefer more clarity there?
Yeah, it's saying that was the intent, that we have it staged or something. I don't think it's inherent in number 3 that that's exactly what it says.
Is it possible to provide a little bit more clarity for council around that? I think there's some.
To actually have it in there.
Yeah, we know our financial position, and I think there's an expectation that no matter what is chosen here, there would be a staged approach over. I don't think people care how many years it might be, but we just want to make a decision either way. Is that possible, Director? Yes. For the record?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Deputy Mayor Jacobs.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Is it true that during the election campaign, Mark McGowan has said that if he gets re-elected, he'll ban plastics in the river area catchments? Because I think I heard that a few days ago in the media. Is that something that, if that was the case, would that we wouldn't have to really do anything because the state government would take care of that? Is my understanding correct?
Director, were you aware of that from us?
I'm happy to take that question on notice, Mr. Mayor.
Take that on notice. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Barry, have you got something you need to ask?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just going through my notes. I note somewhere I just can't find it. There was a risk in the around the sailing club of flooding, and this related to the cafe. Is that land down where the cafe is proposed to be? Does that not have the same inherent risk?
Director. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There's 2 levels of flood risk along the Canning River, where the Shelley Sailing Club is considered the highest risk. Then the toilet block is actually considered the next level down. So still a risk, but less than the location of the Shelley Sailing Club.
Okay, and just the other thing, you can clarify it for me, please. I think 77 says something that currently there's cost $215,000 for the maintenance of the entirety of the Shelley Rossmoyne foreshore. That includes Shelley Beach. If one or more of these, well, not one or more, one goes ahead, that is likely to increase upwards of 2,000. Is that 200,000 on top of 215? So it's basically $500,000 to maintain. Is that correct?
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, but that also includes the whole of the Shelley Rossmoyne foreshore.
That includes the money that we resolved to look after the sedges and stuff like that and go along in a staged fashion along the edge?
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, but that allocation is within our capital expenditure accounts compared to operating accounts, which is for maintenance.
Thank you, councillors. Let's move on. We'll move on to item number. We'll go to item number 6, reports of committee meetings. There are none. We'll go back to our reports. The next report we have was going to be, just for the sake of the record, CC 007 of 21, The title of that report was the Water Corporation Proposed Land Tenure Exchange. That item has been deferred until the April round of meetings. CC, can I just say, for the sake of those in the gallery, if you are here for items that have now been finalised, you're more than welcome to leave, of course, at any time. The next item up is CC 008 of 21. The title of that report being Budget Review as at 28 February 2021. The officer's recommendation is on the screens, also on page 16 of tonight's report. Councillors, do we have any questions in relation to that item? Councillor Kunza. Director Kane.
As there is a considerable change in the presentation of the account for this particular item.
I'm going to have to get you to get to a microphone because we're recording the meeting and we can't hear anything you're saying.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. As there is a considerable change to the presentation, the format of the accounts, I'd seek your leave to do a very short presentation, about 8 minutes, taking you through some of the critical changes and probably adding some more context around what's in the report.
I think it'd be benefit to the council. Yes, I'll allow it. Go ahead.
Thank you. And I'm going to get Mr Hitesh Atwala just to hand out one handout which will become quite clear. And good evening, Mayor, councillors. The mid-year budget review is seeking now to report, as it will all future reports, in a format of accounting known as nature and type reporting. And just so it's quite clear, I'm going to go back into accounting principles. When the city or any council strikes its budget, there are two key elements that you should consider. Firstly, is the budget able to generate an operating surplus? That is the net difference between what you earn and what you spend. And even if you can't, can the budget itself still be in surplus? So for good financial practices, both need to be in consideration. And by way of a fairly simple example, here are two budgets. They both spend the same amount. The income on the left is 111 million, not much different to what the City of Canning's budget is. The income on the right is 109. So when you get to the first part, is it generating an operating surplus? Where we earn more than we spend, the answer is yes. But each of those budgets also require depreciation. And typically councils say, oh, well, depreciation is not a cash item, we don't need to worry about. Now, depreciation is a real item. You use the depreciation cash to renew the asset. So just listening to the discussion on Shelley Beach tonight, if we have not put the depreciation money away, when we come to renew assets like Shelley Beach, like a children's playground, there's no cash in the bank to do it. So the budget on the left generated an operating surplus. The budget on the right didn't. The budget on the left and the budget on the right both require the sale of some assets. So in this case, each year we sell plant and equipment. That's typically where you'd sell items, and you can make sometimes a small loss or gain on it. If you look then, the gain there is consistent, but it's when you get down to the bottom you see the smaller impact. So turning over, we may have made a budget, an operating loss, where we're still showing with grants there we've got a small surplus, but now we need to spend that cash. So here's our $20 million coming back again, and the budget on the left has kept the extra money we had and the surplus. So when we come along to spend $23 million, even though we only had $20 million depreciation, the budget on the left runs an operating, so a budget surplus. The budget at the right doesn't. And we sit in the budget at the right. So let's look at our, so just as a quick principle, this is from the Department's guidance for financial management for local governments. Local governments are encouraged to run an operating surplus. Okay. This is the capacity where if you earn more than you spend, you have cash left over to put into new assets. Shelley Beach, Kent Street Weir, some other project you want to do. You can run short-term losses. You cannot do so consistently. because the only area you can make up the shortfall is through your depreciation cash. Our budget deficit this year has changed. We're going to just take you through what's happened in terms of revenue and the expenditure. The mid-year budget review seeks to bring in all changes to income as well as expenditure. Now, one of the key elements in our budget for this financial year is it relied on a very significant adjusted item, land sales, in order to generate a notional budget surplus. Without that land there, we were earning the 109 and spending 117. Okay, come back. The only area you can make up that shortfall of cash is in depreciation, not putting aside money for future asset replacements. Simply put, the timing of our land sales mean we will not have $7 million worth of land sales coming into our books this year. We'll have $500,000. So what you will see as an operating loss is $10 million. Moving on. We then come back to the issue on the budget position. So the budget position takes in what has the cash and puts it back into your pot to spend, your depreciation. But this year we want to spend that cash plus more. So our total spend, some $54 million. Now you look on the bottom line there, it still says small budget deficit, 1.75 million, I think, from here. My eyes, it's not that good. But the only thing that's making up that to try and show a balanced budget is $19 million of loans. There is nothing wrong with borrowing money to balance a budget, but that money should not be for operating purposes. So what we're doing though, where we start to spend money on capital, which is renewal expenditure, so you've taken an asset and you're simply renewing it, that money should be able to come out of your reserves and be used to pay for that renewal. The new capital can be funded by loans, but then you've got an additional cost on top. Our problem, and I say our, this is my 9th week, our problem is we do not run an operating surplus and we do not run, at this stage, a budget surplus without significant additional finance coming in. That said, with the mid-year budget review, there have been some very significant adjustments we need to make to both revenue and expenditure. The intent of that has been to ensure that we've tried to keep the operating loss of 1.7 million at that level. Now, you have in front of you on the sheet that Mr. Atawala has handed out, the details that are shown on the screen. They break down, as does the operator of the report, line by line, where the variances are in income. Overall, our rating income is reasonably in line with the expectations. But COVID has had a very significant impact on one of our sub-program units, Canning Lodge. For a significant period, Canning Lodge was not able to accept any new patients. Guests, I'm not sure the technical term, residents, thank you. So the operating shortfall in income in Canning Lodge is an additional $500,000. Now, it's slightly offset here because we've had the stimulus coming through from the government that's given us more planning fees. But bear in mind that we don't, with planning fees, whilst they come in, they actually don't actually cover the real cost of doing the service. It puts more income in, but it's only offsetting that loss. Overall, with all the adjustments we're making, the revenue is not the significant challenge for us. There are a number of changes under the expenditure line. As you can see, still coming back down. The income, 109, the expenditure of 117, but we'll show an expenditure of 120 million. Now, you might want to say, well, where does the extra 3 come from? Firstly, that extra 3 includes a number of adjustments that have had an impact on the capital account. When the city outsourced some of its operations last year, particularly for road construction, when employees build a road, it's a capital item. So you can take all of their costs and all of the overheads that are associated for Mr. Bowe's team, and they get capitalised against the project. Now, the way that occurs is the employee goes out there and he's putting concrete or laying the road. His timesheet captures the amount of effort, the labour that's gone into that. Now, we were apportioning overheads. The system was set up to apportion parts of Mr. Bowe's overheads, his staff that is, against those timesheets. But when we chose to change that to an outsourced operation because it gave you more cost effective, the technical systems behind it wasn't able to pick that up. So it didn't have the capacity of adjusting the overheads and simply charging it to materials and contracts. So we were going through and discovered there was some $670,000 of unrecovered overheads that would normally be capitalised but weren't. Now, we can fix this going forward, and we've put in place already mechanisms to make sure it won't happen for next financial year. So labour's gone $670,000 just dealing with that, but we've then simply taken off $670,000 worth of capital cost because that's where the saving is. But you'll see there are other significant costs which we were not able to put into the budget. The workers' compensation premium. Additional costs coming through. Now these are agency labour, probably picked up materials and contract. Canning Lodge, we were unable during the COVID period to recruit to put new staff in there, and we've had to maintain the staffing levels. So we have put agency staff in there, and that's come at a cost to us of another $170,000. You'll see I've tried to put in there the breakdown of other major variances. We had the opportunity with Shelley to put underground and power in. So we've had to bring forward I think it's 470,000 from memory, roughly that figure, of capital cost, which will be recovered in future years. So Western Power won't allow us to proceed with the Shelley underground power if we don't pay for all the design fees up front. And this is different to a normal underground power project. So all of a sudden we've had to bring forward that cost, and it's in the mid-year budget review. Now that will come out and be recovered as a part of the cost recovery in future years, but it represents a cost to us now. The utility charges are several $100,000 more. Now I believe when the budget was first put together, as I wasn't here at that time, that someone may have an expectation that the underground power projects would be delivered earlier and therefore we were getting a saving on utilities. But the reality is the utility spend this year is pretty much the same as last year. So we've had to put in a couple of $100,000 of additional utility costs. During the course of the year, the assets were revalued. As the assets revalued, depreciation goes up. Now look, I bought my own little house back in North Perth in 1988 and it cost me $100,000. And I've done some improvements to it, but if I was to replace that house today, I wouldn't be able to replace it for $100,000. It cost me probably 3 times that. So just as depreciation goes up, we need to allow for that as an additional expense. We need to raise that money to pay for the asset renewal. The playground in Shelley that's referred to earlier on will not be replaced for the same cost that we first put it in. So the depreciation increases. Now you can see there are some other minor changes around insurance costs, and I've mentioned too we've got a line item there to do with works that we're going to do to support the Corinthian Park Tennis Club. But overall, all of that means that the operating loss on a book value, on a nature and type base, has increased, but the balancing then has to happen on the second part of the budget. So if you turn over the page, you will see capital expenditure has reduced. As I mentioned, the wage cost in the top line is now balanced by a reduction in capital expenditure on the second line. And you will see a number of other adjustments we've done there. The bottom line was, when we started this, we wanted to ensure, despite licence and fees costing us more, despite electricity costing us more, despite a number of other expenditures costing us more, we could try and retain the budget deficit as it is. Now, that's taken a lot of pain for a lot of parts of the business, and I use the example of my own situation. So I came in here as the director, and my executive manager, who had worked for me, had already resigned. And Mr. Atawala, that was he'd sit with Mr. Atawala. We are simply not filling his position at the moment. So between the two of us, we're trying to do 3 people's worth of work. Now, I'm not crying foul about that, but that's the pain we've put. Every part of this business has been made to find something to give back. I can't help the fact that Canning Lodge is now going to go from an operating loss of $500,000 to an operating loss of $1 million for this year. But it's still an operating loss that had to be accounted for. So the budget adjustments we're presenting to you tonight will keep the budget deficit as close as possible to the original target. The only significant variance being about $300,000 came out as a result of the audit done on last year's closing position, disclosing that was some $300,000 additional loss than the city staff had first estimated. So the actual budget deficit then sits at 1.7. Mr. Mayor, you can see then the operating losses, though, are being carried for year after year and getting larger. You can see that there is no provision for the city's depreciation to go as cash back in the reserves. As I've said to you, this, I believe, is an unsustainable financial position for the good of all of our asset base and the development city. It is fixable, and that's what will be the subject of the first workshop of the long-term financial plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions, councillors? Councillor Holland? Mr. Kane, did you want to... Oh, you can come back to your seat. Up to you.
I've got lots and lots.
Can I just say, though, before you launch into lots and lots, we do have a workshop on this matter in a couple of weeks' time, so it's imperative that they're asked tonight.
Yes, because one of the things that really concerns me is we're having the workshop after we're going to ratify this the day after. I've got a real problem with that. Why can't we have it the day before? You asked me to, I am on, sorry. You asked me to ratify something where we're going to have a workshop after we've done it, which is next Tuesday is when you want the monthly financials to go through, and we're going to have the workshop the day after. I've got a real problem with that, and I would ask that that be reconsidered. I'll go on with my others if you want, if you wish.
But you can't change the past, so we're passing the financial reports from the past quarter. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, but there's a lot of questions in it, in the report, why it's got to the position where we are now. It was 1.73, now it's up to 9 or 11 million or whatever it is, which has changed in a matter of days. Some of the things I can't understand. I can understand Canning Lodge because of COVID. I can understand all those things, and I can understand, right, we're going to have things are going to happen due to COVID that are outside our control and are totally unforeseen, as COVID was. No one knew what the impact was. So that part of it, yeah, I can understand, and I'm quite happy to accept that there's an extra $500,000 there. What I can't understand is why the overheads weren't capitalised and how that happened in the first place. How did it get past the auditors that we weren't including depreciation and that we were going to operating losses, like you said? You said it was fixable, but it was unsustainable at the moment.
You want to just ask these one at a time, because I'm...
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, so go on.
I think the first one was Mr. Kane, Councillor Holland has some concerns about why the matter is being dealt with on Tuesday night, yet the workshop's sometime after it. Is there a link between the two, and do you see a concern?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, there are two separate issues here. Firstly, under the Local Government Act, there's a statutory requirement for the city to adopt a mid-year budget review. So the mid-year budget review simply ropes in all the adjustments necessary in income and expenditure to show the city's actual financial position. The long-term financial plan, though, is about then adjusting the parameters that are necessary to bring us back to a sustainable financial position. So the two aren't linked, But this should provide a good segue into the long-term financial plan discussions. I'm happy to keep going with the answers just now.
Yes, please, keep going.
Thank you. Okay. So the issue on the overheads is something I believe that should have been picked up much earlier. It should have been. Now, I'm not here to blame or deal with anyone, but you were losing a finance director, you'd lost a 2IC to the finance director. I don't know whether anyone knew the system wasn't carefully accounting for that, but the first time it really became evident was when we had to do the mid-year budget review. And so having identified the issue, it was also important that we could provide a fix to it. And it has to be a system fix. So the IT system, and as soon as I was aware of it with discussion with Mr. Bowe and then with my own staff, there is a fix. So this won't happen for next financial year. We will allocate the internal overheads back on all capital projects as we normally would, regardless of whether they're done with our staff or they've completed with the contract. The bottom line is, though, it doesn't impact the bottom line. It simply means that we've had more expenditure sitting in wages and salaries than we would down in the line of capital expenditure. So I've made sure that they're netting the two, and it hasn't been that we've suddenly said, oh, we're going to do more capital expenditure or less capital expenditure. The issue on depreciation, I believe, is one that's been known to, I'm told anyway, I can only say this, known to council for some time. So looking at this, the council has run a deficit budget for the 4 years I can see of the long-term financial plan. It has not been providing for that depreciation, and you would have seen your reserves diminishing in value and a greater reliance on loan funds. So this shouldn't necessarily come as a surprise. But one of the reasons I want to show it in nature and type going forward, the problem with using a program format is very hard to understand. And when we talk about transport or different accounts, you can simply get to the bottom line and say, look, it says surplus. Doesn't mean we have a surplus position. But by showing it as clearly as I can, as we can, with income on one line and expenditure on another, with what you have left over as a surplus, and then where you're going to use it as a capital, it becomes much more transparent that there is the challenge here that needs to be fixed.
Councillor Holland, you've still got a number of questions.
Yeah,
I think.
I'll try and be brief because I don't want to hog the whole line. I can't work out why workers' compensation premiums were not in the budget to start with. Why we weren't told of the change of the underground power situation with Western Power. I'm not an accountant like I said before, but I damn well know that the cost of replacing an asset in the future is going to be more than it is to build it now. I think that's common sense. But the loss of income at Canning Lodge I think is okay, but you still haven't they told me how the auditors didn't pick this up, especially about depreciation and also about the program with capital as opposed to wages that you were talking about that are in-house and out-of-house, as it were, or subcontracting. We were told when we passed the budget last year, I even put something through and that was no penalty on interest, and I was told, right, there's going to be some repercussions on that financially, and I said, okay, and it was up to us to make a decision whether we would go ahead with that when we did. We were told by the state government that we had to freeze rates, and so we did that, although we could have probably gone against it, but we decided to go with it like everybody else did. So we're all anticipating, right, this is going to be a pretty ordinary budget or a horror budget or whatever you want to call it, but it came back as quite a good budget at what we thought. And now I'm getting told that we're $11 million in the red just a few months later. I don't understand how this could happen. And how, like I said, I'm not an accountant. You said we should have been aware. We're aware of what we're told and explained to us to a certain extent. I'm a paralegal. I'm not an accountant. Graham, if you don't mind, Graham, you're a painter. You're not an accountant, which I'm not having a go at anything here. I could be just a clerk in an office for another one of expression of what my job is. I'm not an accountant, and so we rely, and we all ask questions very good, to get the information. I just felt like I've been unless I've just completely misunderstood everything, that I thought we had a good budget, and now we're finding out we haven't. And there's serious concerns. I mean, why didn't the auditors pick this up?
Are you saying that you're not an accountant?
Bloody oath I am.
Only
And I
asked
wasn't
because you
having
said
a
it
go
about
at
6
anybody
times.
else. It was just the example I was meaning. I'm practically the lowest of the low. It's not
Director
the point.
Kane, I think the questions started with a workers' compensation,
Yes,
a query around that.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor. The way workers' compensation premiums work is you get it, as I understand it, you get the initial estimate. Then if there are issues to do with past claims that are still left over, they can come back and make adjustments on it. Now, we have a fund, one of the reserve accounts we do, to try and smooth that. And we have to put in surpluses from, or we try and put in surpluses that we get from some of the insurance rebates we've got. But the city's been eating that for the last couple of years that I can see. The additional premium cost relates to past years' cost, and suddenly it's a real cost to be paid for. I agree with Councillor Holland just on the UGP. I presumed, again, it's before my time, that some advice would have been given to Mr. Hitesh Atawala. I might speak to this in a minute if you wish, Mr. Mayor, just that would be a cost. But the reality is it's a cost now, but it's a recoverable cost. So Western Power come along and say, for this particular category of underground power project, we're going to give you the opportunity to do it now because we're about to replace assets in the area, and we'd rather not just replace assets, but might like to upgrade them. So you're going to get a one-off opportunity to do something which wouldn't normally be there. But they say because it's not funded by the state government SUP programs, Strategic Underground Power Project, you have to pay for the design costs up front. So we have to pay this $500,000 design cost up front, but it will be recoverable back as a user charge as we would any other underground power project. Now, Mr. Mayor, I don't know at what stage or who that advice was given to. I can only record it here for you in the matters to do with this budget review. Can I just come back to this point on the budget position? The reason I put those few slides in the beginning to differentiate the difference between an operating surplus and a budget surplus was just to remind us all that the budget surplus was predicated only on being able to sell $7 million worth of land. Now, we were using land as an adjusting figure in there to show that there would be a budget surplus. And now, the timing of the key parcel of land, which is the piece for Metronet, means there will be no money coming in this year. So we net it back out, which is the danger of trying to use land as an adjusting item. If you didn't have that right from the outset, the budget deficit would have shown a deficit of $7.5–8 million, not the 1.7 it had here. The other adjustments, Mr. Mayor, on penalty interest, I can't comment. I wasn't here at that particular time.
Thank you. Councillor Ponaturo.
I've got a few questions and concerns. Just because we are asked to be nose in, fingers out in our position. So I'm not getting into. Firstly, my question is, can we have this meeting Wednesday meeting, Monday before the Tuesday OCM? Because I think that's it's a common sense for us to have that. Secondly, yes, we approved the budget as a council. So who is in this case? If it's a board, it's a different question because the board is liability, so the board has to absorb the liability of that problem. Okay, it's a kind of a ignorance decision, or we're not in a very good financial situation. So who bears the liability? And I'm not trying to say blame game here, but as even previously Mr. Councillor Holland mentioned, we are here to make a strategic decisions and add up the budget. But who is to take the responsible now here?
I'm not sure that we.
There are a few more questions. Just want to know.
I'm not sure there's any value in. Look, I'm going to rule that question irrelevant. There's no reason to be laying blame on anyone here tonight. I think we've got a workshop coming up in a couple of weeks' time. If you've got another question, I'm happy to entertain it.
Okay, I have a few more questions. Yes, I would like to
Okay.
see the workbook questions. So when Director, through Mr. Mayor, when Director Kane, you mentioned about we might have to dip into the reserves to make our situation looks better, the deficit, does it mean breaking into our investments? Is that what you mean, reserves? I've got a few more questions.
Director Kane, are we proposing to break into our investments?
The point I was making about the reserves is we simply haven't been transferring depreciation cash into the reserve because we don't have any depreciation cash. So if you look at the total value in our reserve now, 48% of it is made up of two line items. The waste reserve holds the bulk of it, and there's one other small line item that holds another 5% to do with the user charge. We have $220 million of fixed assets, that's built infrastructure on top of our land. The total sum we have in reserve for infrastructure repairs and maintenance is $1 million, and that's already committed. Now, that's a reflection of what happens year after year. If you do not run an operating surplus and therefore cash back your reserve, something has to give out. Now, I've looked back at several years of reserves where the budget position said it would transfer in this sum of money, and that just didn't happen. And it didn't happen because the money was never generated through income sources. So that's why important when you look, again, Mr. Mayor, I'll just make the observation about the importance of looking at your long-term financial plan each year as part of the budget. If you simply wait for 4 years to look back at the long-term financial plan and say, how could it be so far apart? Then we've let it get apart. Good financial practice should say that each year as part of setting the budget, so this year going forward, my staff should say, here's Council's long-term financial plan, that's the starting point. But we can't. The long-term financial plan would say this year we should have had a budget income of $125 million, not 110. It says we'd have a budget expenditure of 115, which is pretty much what we had. But there have just been too many significant variances to make this year's the long-term financial plan a basis by which you can start. We have to start again.
Councillor?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So when you say we're going to start again, so are we going to start from zero-based budget, scratch, is what you're saying, or are we going to carry on from the losses we haven't to fix that from previous year? What do you mean by, thank you, Mr. Director?
Director?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Simply put, we can't use the existing long-term financial plan as a starting point. We have to use the point we're at now. Now, the losses we've got in the last couple of years need to be repaid. They need to be pushed back. You can keep leaving them on the books, but it's just not sustainable. So in resetting this year's budget, we do it on a zero base for each part of the business. But if I said to you we're $10 million short on income compared to a long-term financial plan, you simply couldn't adjust that in 1 year. So we have to be prepared for adjustments over a number of years to bring ourselves back to a sustainable financial position.
Yes, thank you.
So that's obviously going to take us some innovative ideas and plans to make the $10 million, because it's not going to happen overnight, even over 4 years. So that's going to be deep diving into a good workshop. So that's why I'm just thinking, Mr. Mayor, I think we should all agree that we should bring this forward before the council meeting, or maybe we might have to push this item back again. I mean, that's my...
Push what back again?
I mean, this particular item, I'm just saying, because we'll be much more comfortable position as well.
Director Kane, can I get you just to clear this up once and for all? We don't need to hold this workshop before we speak about this item at the OCM?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You don't. So this is a statutory requirement to adopt the mid-year budget review. And when you look at that last screen up there, you'll still see the one figure. We have started this year with a budget deficit of 1.7 million, And with all the changes we're presenting to you tonight, we have worked damn hard to make sure it's only 1.7 million. And that includes the additional $500,000 loss on Canning Lodge. It includes the additional $200,000 of licence fees for IT systems that were missed out. It includes an additional $200,000 of electricity. It includes the additional sums to do with workers' compensation premium. So, Mr Mayor, the position we're presenting council is one that leaves them in the same financial position as adopted in the budget, with significant variances across each line item. But as a piece that gives council clear notice, we need to recognise we can't go on as we have, and we make change to ensure the system is stable for the future.
All right. I think, thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Director Kane. Yeah, let's start on and working on a serious plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Director Bowe, did you have something you wanted to say? I think it might have been in relation to the underground power. Just back up the truck a little bit, Director
It was in relation to the underground power. Council in April last year resolved to progress with the Shelley East retrospective underground power project and liaise with Western Power to defer the cash calls. And then when the budget was passed, Council passed the budget by deferring leverage applying the service charges on the residents. And that was understood, and that was agreed to at the time. And there was also a decision made in December which accepted the payment of the pre-design work of 490,000. So I just wanted to bring councillors' attention to that for a bit of balance. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Sweeney.
Yeah, for Mr Kane, through you, Mr Mayor. A lot of things have changed in the last few weeks, from what I'm seeing anyway, and you know, I guess as councillors, we lay a lot of faith in the administration to inform us about these things. And we are told at every meeting that the budget, the financial position of the council is in a very sound position. The individuals that are responsible for these comments and our finances have now left, and you've been parachuted in. And it seems to me you've done an enormous amount of work in the last couple of weeks, but you have identified a lot of anomalies that I think are a concern to all of us. And, you know, discrepancies, anomalies, some of your words were outdated information, overheads that haven't been identified, expenditure not easily tracked, underestimated by several hundred thousands of dollars. As I said, you know, you've come in and you completely changed all our accounting processes and our balance sheets, and you've put in a new matrix on how we account for our finances and our revenue from year to year. I'm just wondering now at the moment, and with the greatest respect, Mr Kane, I'm just thinking to myself that a lot of the things that you are saying to us at the moment are largely untested. We don't really know what you're shoveling here, whether or not we should be buying this. For me, I'm only speaking for myself right now. So, on one hand, only a few weeks ago we were told one thing, and now you've come in and you're telling us something completely different, which is really largely untested. I'm not sure at the moment exactly where our finances are. There are some discrepancies that maybe I can talk to you later about in some of the things that I've identified myself, just in some of the stuff that you've sent us. But I'm not sure, councillors, whether or not we're in a position, perhaps, and we need to maybe discuss this next week, whether or not we're in a position to look at maybe an independent audit of what has occurred in the last few weeks.
I'll just stop you right there. I need to ask a question.
That is, okay, well, I'll ask Mr Kane. Just hold on.
Just ask a question.
Just hold on there.
Hang on a sec. I'll just hold you up right there. I'll ask you to speak respectfully to the chair. Don't tell me to hold it up. This is my meeting. You've been now speaking for a number of minutes without asking a question. You've been making all sorts of assertions in regards to what the city's administration is and isn't doing wrong, in your opinion. I've allowed you to proceed. I'm now asking you to ask a question. If you can't ask a question, then stand down.
Well, I was about to ask it, but I was interrupted.
Well, then ask your question, Councillor.
But before I ask a question, these
Not before you ask a question. I'll ask you to ask your question, councillor, or move on.
Well, I just want to ratify something what you've just said to me, because these aren't my opinions. These are something that has been identified by Mr. Kane. So.
Well, then ask him the question. What's the question that you have?
Well, you just said that these were things that I raised. They weren't things that I raised. These were items that Mr. Kane raised. So I just wanted to correct that. Mr. Kane, are we in a position? Are we to your knowledge, to the best of your knowledge right now, with our finances and the amount of work that you have put in the last few weeks, are we in a position where we possibly should look at an independent auditor to come in? Because a lot of this has not been picked up in previous audits. I'm just concerned.
Thank you.
With
You've asked your question.
at the moment.
Director Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, a couple of things. Firstly, the auditor accounts are still audited by the Auditor General, and nothing in the data I presented to you tonight would fail, in my view, an audit test. I've simply presented the accounts can be presented each month in accordance with the Act in either one of two formats, by program or by nature and type. The trouble is, when you show it by program, you really don't get down to the nub of where the costs are going. So by showing it by nature and type, which is something we've done, did the last 15 years at the City of Coburn, it's very clear what you earn on one level and what you spend on the next, broken down into key categories. So I'm quite happy to put my reputation at stake here and said you could test anything I've said to you tonight and it will meet the requirement for financial probity. There are some issues to do with the way we constructed, and I put myself in that position because whilst I wasn't here last year, I'm sitting in the chair now, where we constructed some lines in the budget. There were some costs where a decision was made not to report licences and IT licences as a disaggregated spend, but to get a better hold of that expenditure and bring it all into one account. And a budget estimate was made on the best estimates of $1.7 million worth of expenditure. But the actual expenditure, when people had gone through and looked at the bills, was $2 million. So we had to find an extra $300,000 to plug that hole. As I said, the underspend on electricity should probably have been picked up on an aggregated level. I can only presume that a decision or an assumption may have been made around the timing of underground power, and therefore we would have a lesser spend on that as a utility expense. Now, no one could have predicted the full effect of COVID. You had made allowances for COVID in part, and as Councillor Holland has already said, we had the option, or we had the requirement as the government has said, to freeze rates, to freeze all charges, and that costs a significant amount to the city, because your other costs are still going to go up, but your income at that level was frozen. But frankly, even without the COVID freeze, we had a significant problem, and that significant problem is this. We weren't funding and haven't been funding depreciation fully for a number of years. And in doing so, the cash tin has got less, and now it's got to the crunch time that when people ask for extra things to spend the money, I'm simply saying to Director Bowe when he came to me with the Shelley Beach, he said, look, Mr Bowe, there's just no money there to progress it. And we have to be realistic. Now, we can fix this, and we have to fix this, but I'm intending for all of the workshops to show you the real status of your infrastructure. And the first workshop we have will show you two pieces of infrastructure that you would probably never see. And when you actually see the state of them, because they sit underground, etc., you say, how could they have got to that level? Well, they're just on their life of type wearing out. And all of a sudden you now need to replace them, and there's no money to do it because we did not cash back depreciation.
Councillor Ponaturo.
Thank you so much. And thanks, Director Stephen Kane. Just quickly, the 300K you mentioned, was it the committed didn't we actually pick that under the committed amount? But that's where we make, and I think I remember very firmly, even when I was elected as a councillor, at the part of the financial statement that we should be reporting all the committed amounts, but that's where the major risk in any capex project. So one of the things, my question is, did you pick that out of that committed amount that we didn't capture very well, that you had to find 300K? The other thing you mentioned earlier about the system error, you mentioned system error on the overhead capex projects too. So is it part of the cost coding is the error? But I don't want to again get into the operation level, but because where we are right now, I'm a little bit more getting curious into my accounting and capex cost coding. So is it the cost coding is the issue, and also is the commitment, are we not picking up the commitments well?
Thank you. Director.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You'd see quite clearly the statements here. There is a summary of all commitments in there, and I've made sure that those commitments reflect the actual costs of what we have going through. So you look particularly under the capital line, there's an actual spend and there's a committed spend. Because the last thing I want is any of our staff to be spending more money on projects that we actually have. And to be fair, Director Bowe and his team do a very good job of going through and ensuring that money is spent wisely, but not freely. The issue for the systems under allocation of the overheads, frankly, I don't know why it wasn't identified earlier. Yeah, it's probably, I suspect, when you get a small variation each month, you don't quite realise something's going on until someone gets 6 months and said, there's $500,000 of extra expenditure. Where is it coming from? And that's when we identified clearly there was an error. And again, to be fair to Director Bowe, he took action with that and his staff. And you'll see that when you look at there's a part of the report that talks about 2 adjustments, both of them, one to Director Bowe's area. He's made sure that any cost overrun in one area has been absorbed by taking costs out of another.
Thank you. Councillor Pontori.
Sorry, I won't hold too long. But again, Director Kane, looking at this proposed change in operating budget, nature and type you've given us, but here we have adapted budget, that's fine. Then we have a revised budget, that's fine. Then proposed, but where do we see the commitment? I mean, or we wouldn't, or you wouldn't be reporting here? One question.
Director Kane.
Thank you, through the Chair. So this is just a short summary document for you. If you go into the actual agenda items, you will see that it contains fairly clear a summary that shows the revised, the actuals, and a line item that says commitments and then variance. So what we've done is we've pushed into that the adopted position will have all the values of commitments in there as well. The idea at this stage is in adopting your mid-year budget review, we shouldn't have to come back now and make any substantive changes to the budget before the end of the financial year.
Councillor.
Yeah, I did note that the 6.6 million in the committed area on that item. Just a couple more questions. Is it possible for us to ask to have a dashboard report of the capex project, so we wouldn't probably get to know end of the year where our risks are, but going forward, like monthly, is it possible for us to have a dashboard report on a capital project? But we can perhaps set up a particular value, anything more than $1 million worth of project that we would like to see that. I think I've been probably asking for that for a while too.
Councillor, I'll just ask you to make sure your questions are relevant. Suggestion is wonderful. We're talking about the budget review. So
yeah, that's exactly.
No, it's not. You're talking about suggestion for a dashboard. So that might be something that the city might consider later, and you could probably put that in an email, but we need these questions to be relevant to the item under discussion, which is about the budget review item. It's about the report in front of you. So,
Mr. Mayor, just again, I might want to reiterate this again very clearly. I just want to clarify. I have asked a few years ago that we would like to see the dashboard report of CapEx project.
And I'm telling you that's not a question that's relevant for tonight.
Okay. So that's when we have not seen it, then we are actually looking at the risk after 3 years' time. So to avoid that now, it's too late for us, but we need to fix it right now.
Okay, sure, it's been noted. Your next question?
No, but I'm saying...
I'm not arguing with you, councillor. I'm asking you to stay relevant. I'm ruling that question irrelevant, so please move on.
Because CapEx
Don't
project...
say no to me. I've ruled that the question is not relevant. Would you please move to your next question?
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, can I just clarify
I'm not
one thing?
entertaining you. If you don't want to continue with your questioning, I'll move to somebody else. I'm ruling that that question is not relevant. Would you please ask your next question?
So are we still talking about CapEx projects and risk in this today, in this evening?
Ask about the CapEx projects. If it's actually referenced in here, you're making suggestions about the way in which you would like these reports to look. I'm saying that's not relevant to the discussion.
Okay.
Now, I don't expect you to argue with me. I'm making a ruling. I'm asking you to move on.
Okay.
Please move on.
Okay, I'm asking a question. Are we allowed to get a dashboard report on CapEx project in a particular set value more than $1 million or so?
Councillor, I'm ruling that question irrelevant. Please move on.
Okay, my last question is, we are in this situation and everybody's fairly frozen and sitting and thinking that did we not make the right decision or not? With due respect, I would like an advice from our CEO, whether did we make a mistake in making any of the decision, or what is his advice in this area as a CEO? What would you like to say in this?
Do you understand the
Probably,
question?
thank you. I can clarify if it's not clear.
CEO.
I think you're asking who made the mistake. I'm not going to attribute any responsibility on that question, and I think it's the wrong question to ask. Mr. Kane has given you a description of how we've got to this position, and it's been the culmination of a number of decisions over a period of time, and we collectively own responsibility for where we are at the moment. So I'm not going to attribute any responsibility, blame or otherwise. I just think it's unhelpful to do that.
Thanks, councillors. Councillor Kunza and then Councillor Bain.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, under point 17 in the report, 17A and 2 and 3 talk about $130,000 cost within the Office of the CEO of redundancy, 130. 3 talks about 210 within statutory planning, and then number 6 talks about a total quantum of 800,000 as part of the redundancy and organisational restructure. Are those two, 130 and 210, in that 800, or is it additional? And how long is it expected that this organisational restructure, in terms of many of these positions will not be filled and generate savings in the future, what is the expected length of time for this to be recovered?
Director Kane.
Thank you, Wish. I can probably answer part of that, but not all of this particular point of time. So the redundancy cost has to be absorbed this particular financial year, or when the redundancy first put forward. Provisions are made for that. Those salary costs then will drop out next year out of next year's budget. We won't be budgeting for those positions, and it will become a material and contract spend. So the balance was done that we said we could, in the 800,000, we could get this work done more cheaply by outsourcing it than by having our own staff. I just make the observation, the same thing we did at the City of Coburn, where we chose not to have our own construction crew because of the intermittent nature of the work. It's a lot easier to bring people in, just build roads when you need a road built, rather than just trying to find work for them. The other question I think you asked was about planning fees.
No, there were 3 separate line items for redundancies and the organisational restructure, and the second part was about how long would it take to actually identify or generate the savings that are prognosticated in the report.
So through the Chair, the savings will attribute to next financial year. They won't flow because obviously you've got to deal with the cost of the redundancy this year, but from next year onwards there'll be savings in that particular program.
I've got Director Bowe would like you to make a quick comment too. Director Bowe.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just in relation to dot point 6 there, Councillor Kunza, that references to the project construction restructure that was undertaken within the Build Canning sub-program and directly relates to Director Kane's assessment in relation to outsourcing versus retaining staff, and that was reported through to council via a memo or email from memory.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just didn't
Councillor
stipulate
Clinton?
that in the point, so I wasn't quite sure.
Thank you. Councillor Bain?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So I'm just referring to point 22E, deferral of the Centenary Park West shared path. I was advised previously it was anticipated that this project will be delivered next financial year. Is that still the case?
Director?
Certainly having to defer it, Councillor Bain, as a result of our budget review, would lend itself to being reconsidered as part of 2021-22, yes.
Thank you. Councillor Barry?
I won't bother standing up. Look, I don't know. So, through you, Mr Mayor, to Director Kane, capital expenditure you said will be deferred. How much capital expenditure will be deferred?
Director?
Is that this financial year or next financial year as well?
Director?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think the reference there was back to that particular line item. If you go to point 22, where we've identified the individual capital items we deferred, the attachment also goes through in detail for any other references to that. Mr Bowe might wish to add anything else, particularly around that issue, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Bowe.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just in relation specifically to Welshpool Road, that had previously been reported to Council probably 6 or so weeks ago that we were going to actually deliver that project this financial year. But the budget review has identified a need to bring in a number of those capital projects or defer them, so it won't be done this financial year now. I thought you might have been on top of that one, Councillor Barry.
So just a question in relation to the legal compliance, can you explain that on page 22? Are we talking, is that budget review what we're talking about now between January 1 and 30th of each year? A local government has to carry out a review within 30 days. It's to be submitted to Council. Within 30 days after Council has made the determination, a copy of the review and the determination is provided to the department. Is that what we're doing?
Director Kane?
That's correct, Mr Mayor.
So the question is, why the hurry if we've got 30 days after we make the determination?
Director Kane?
And I only say that, with all due respect, Mr Mayor, I only say that because a number of people have already said 2 or 3 times, why can't we have this meeting before we make follow a recommendation or a resolution towards it? I mean, if we've got 30 days after, when does that give us to? Until we make a determination. It could go out to May or June. Is that correct? No?
Director Kane?
Thank you. No, Mr Mayor, it's not. If you look at the first item, between 1st of January and 31st of March, so today's the 9th of March, next week is the 16th of March, I think. Beware the Ides of March. That's next Monday, by the way. If you wanted to have a workshop, Caesar might be turning up with us. You've only got till the 31st. Exactly. You've only got till the 31st to complete it, and then after you've got a maximum 1 month after you've completed it to submit it to the department. Now, why they allow for a month, I have no idea. Basically, the day after you finish it, other than the fact it takes a week or so to get your minutes out, you should be able to send the review straight off to the department. But we have till the 31st of March at the maximum to adopt a review in this particular item.
Well, then the question, I suppose, begs, could it be, or is it possible, that we could defer this and still have a special council meeting on this particular item and have it to the Minister within 30 days of the 31st of March, or even the 31st of March?
Director Kane?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Other than what other activities the Council has at the same time, Council can choose to defer it if it wishes. It just needs to make sure that the review is complete by the 31st. I simply point out again, Mr Mayor, the review that we're presenting to you leaves you in the same financial position as you adopted from a budget deficit position. But we've worked very hard to make sure that was the outcome. But there are significant changes across the line items and where income and particularly expenditure is sitting between the operating expenditure and the capital expenditure.
Yes, I finish. Yeah, I understand that, but I'll just go to two that I see that are in here in the capex land project, 700 for. I presume that was the Cannington Leisureplex one, and then the CLP splash pad 400. Were they the two that were associated with each other? So there's $1.1 million worth there. Is that correct? Is that what those two are for?
Director Kane.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Again, before my time, but I understood that the upgrade of Cannington could only proceed if we achieved the land sale that was associated with it. Once the land sale fell through, you couldn't spend the money on the capex, so the two balance each other out. We still have the land, but we can't proceed with the upgrade.
So were we working on the assumption that the land would be sold, and then in turn, $400,000 of that money would have been spent on the splash pad?
Director Kane.
Mr Mayor, I wasn't here when you struck your budget last year, and therefore all the assumptions that were debated or discussed with Council at that time are unknown to me. I presume, though, this is something that would have been discussed at the time you did the budget last year, and therefore there was some understanding of what it was. If not, it would have come up during the year when the item was presented to Council. I just can't give any more context, Mr Mayor.
Well, I mean, the next question is that probably there was a lot of those things that were unbudgeted items. I mean, and then you go on to say that a lot of this was predicated upon the sale of $7 million in land, and this was happening in a soft market, and that was probably the reason that the 700,000 one didn't go ahead, and still we purchased. And I'm just wondering then, is that considered to be prudent, particularly from us as a council, the elected members, of our fiduciary duty? Because it would seem that a lot of people here, and I too, find this very, very important, and I'd like to hear it in language that I can understand. But it seems that not trying to play the blame game, but how did it happen? Why were we never told there was an operating deficit going on for 4 years? The other question then begs is, don't we have the right to believe that the budget situation, no matter who it is, whether it was the two people that left, you or any one of you gentlemen there, that you would leave this place in good stead, and not to the point where now these questions, look, 8 minutes is not enough to go over this. And I mean that with all due respect, and obviously you work very hard, but I mean, this just seems such a mess to me. And
you can organise to, if you'd like to defer it, obviously you can choose to do that if you like, but I guess there's no point doing that unless we can schedule in that workshop before it.
Well, so, I'm sure, Mr Mayor, I'm sure that there's nobody here would say no to it.
I've got plenty of time.
And we need to
Mr Kane, are we in a position where if Council chose to defer this, first of all, can we make our statutory deadlines by deferring it, and can we fit a workshop in between next Tuesday and the proposed special council meeting, whenever that would be decided upon by admin?
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, Mr Mayor. Sorry, I'm in the wrong council, aren't I? There you go. It's Groundhog Day. Look, if Council wishes to have the workshop on the long-term financial plan next Monday night, my diary is free to do that. As I said, the only thing, beware the Ides of March. I don't want to come along with a flak jacket. That you can take plastic spoons. However, I said and if Council then, even when it listened to the material that will present at the long-term financial plan, then turned up on Tuesday night and said, well, we want to defer it, that's up to Council at the time. I said the position we're presenting to you, and we've tried to go into a lot of detail tonight, was around these significant variations, but to reassure you that what we've tried to do through all of this is to give you the same bottom line position we had at the start of the year. There is a significant issue, though. When the budget was struck, it was relying on to get remember, I've tried to point out what the operating deficit is or a budget deficit. $7 million of land used to balance a budget would have been fairly obvious that there was still a big operating deficit. Now, when you see it in nature and type, it stands out. When you see it by program, it might not have stood out as much to you. And that's why I think this is a better form of presenting the data.
Yes, go ahead, Councillor Barry.
So, and yes, I hope that comes to pass. But in your professional opinion, given what we're reading here and what you've said, do you envisage a rise in rates in the next financial year? And if so, around what percent?
Director Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There are two issues that need to fundamentally change: the revenue and the expenditure. You can't just pull one and not the other to get the position back to balance. The adjustments, and when you see it in the long-term financial plan, we have let the revenue line vary significantly. We're a long way off having a balanced budget. There would have to be a rate rise as part of that adjustment to make it. The timing of that is up to council. But can I tell you, I would not be leaving this position to go on, because the more we kick the can down the road, the worse it gets. Since I've been here, councillors have asked me, virtually half of them sitting here have asked me about projects they would like to see. Councillor Beery's not here tonight, and she asked me about stuff to do with TS Canning. And I'm going to go out and look at the state of the facilities, but I've already been told they need significant expenditure. And there's just no money there. So until we fix this issue, until we fix the structural issue, and we raise enough income to cover our full depreciation costs, this issue is going to get worse.
Thank you. Councillor Holland.
I'll just be brief, Mr. Mayor. I understand that you should not be selling assets to balance an operating thing, and the questions we're trying to I won't speak for everybody else, but I'll speak for myself, is work out why we did that in the first place. I understand the work you've done in here, which is quite tremendous actually. You're losing me a lot of the time, but I'll try my hardest to get everything. You put it as clear, and I also understand the urgency of the situation. I think if we could have, we don't necessarily have to defer this, because, like you said, if you kick it down the can down the road, you're postponing the inevitable what's going to happen. But I still think we could still have a meeting next Monday, just a workshop on that, but they still can come to council on Tuesday. It doesn't have to go to a special council meeting, just a suggestion, excuse me, not making a question, but it doesn't have to go to a council meeting, and I think, I won't speak for everybody else, but it'll give us all that little bit.
Well, let's see if we can get it arranged between now and Monday then.
And the other part is, how did we put that selling of assets? I know that you can't sell the family farm because you'll never get it back. You cannot rely on selling the mayor's house for $1 million because the market changes.
I've just sold my house for $1 million. Thanks very much. Can I ask?
I know.
Can we perhaps leave that till Monday? That question.
Yeah.
Because we're going to have a workshop. We've got a massive night ahead of us, councillors.
No, I'm happy. Thank you.
So I'm pretty keen to move on. We've been on this item now for over an hour. So if we, Director Kane, obviously has been requested by Councillor Ponaturo and others, I think there's merit in perhaps progressing a meeting on Monday. And we'll just have to make sure everyone's available. Councillors, I'd like to move on now, if I can. Councillor Spencer Teo, did you have a question you needed to ask? Thank you very much. We shall therefore move on. We will now move on to, let me see, CC 009 of 21, which is the monthly financial report of February 2021. Are there any questions specifically on that before we move on? Notwithstanding, we've got a workshop on Monday. Councillor Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, just on page 5, you have the infrastructure assets, the positive variance of $9 million, and another one where I think it's capital expenditure of 3.5. Like, I've asked this before, and I don't really know how we get these surpluses. I mean, it's probably a question for Monday night. But is it likely that...
Did you want to leave it till Monday night then?
No, well, I mean, just the question is, I've got it because I'm rattling on. Those $9 million, is that a positive variance, or are they projects that we're just not going to get done
Director Kane?
in the next 3 months? And therefore be carried over.
Could I just ask Councillor Barry to give me the page number?
Page 5, I think he said. Is that right,
Page
Councillor?
5, or it's 13 of 31.
13 to 31. I'm going backwards and forwards on this.
Yes, now you know the trouble.
Have you got a paragraph number? Is there a paragraph number next to in the left-hand column?
No, it's
No. Oh, okay. All right. Sorry.
page 30.
Look, I'll take that on
Okay.
notice if I can, Mr Mayor, and perhaps
Yes,
I could just
okay.
sit down with
All right.
Councillor Barry after this.
But
Terrific.
like I said, and if we could have it in lay language, please.
Lay language has been requested, Director, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you.
Next item, councillors, is item 7.3, the responsible officer being Director Graham Bride, the Director of Canning Development. The report is SD 006 of 21. The title of that report being Adoption of Revised Policy CM 183 being Public Art. The recommendation for that is on page 40 of tonight's agenda and is on the screen. Have any questions, councillors, in relation to the matter? No? We move on. Thank you. Councillors, the next matter is proposed Canning Dog Local Law 2021, the report being SD 007 of 21. The recommendation is on our screen and is at page 52 of tonight's agenda. Are there any questions on that matter before we move on? Thank you, councillors. We will move on to SD 008 of 21, proposed City of Canning Parking Amendment Local Law 2021, page 68 of tonight's agenda and on screen. Any questions? Councillor Bain.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So under the current local law, can an authorised person direct a driver to move their vehicle from a verge if it is obstructing sight lines? Thank you.
Director Bride.
Through Mr Mayor, tonight we've got Mr Clint Burdett, our Manager of Regulatory Services, and obviously Shane Mallon, Manager of Community Safety. I think this one's probably for Mr Mallon. Thank you.
Mr Mallon, was about an obstructing parked vehicle. Can an authorised person require them to be moved? You're talking about other than a police officer? You're talking about our own people?
City personnel.
Yep, city personnel.
Yeah, through you, Mr Mayor, an authorised officer can direct a vehicle to be removed or moved. However, the current local laws do not cover sightline offences.
Councillor Bain, thank you. Any other questions, Councillor, before we move on? Thank you. We'll move on then to SD 009 of 21. That's the proposed City of Canning Waste Local Law of 2021. The recommendation for that item is on page 77 of tonight's agenda and is also on your screens. Councillors, do we have any questions in regards to that matter? No, thank you. We move on to SD 010 of 21, proposed City of Canning Fencing Local Law of 2021. The recommendation is on page 89 and is on the screen. Councillors, any questions in regards to the fencing? Thank you. No, we will move to SD 011 of 21, the title of that report being Proposed City of Canning Local Government Property and Public Places Local Law 2021. The recommendation being page 98 of tonight's report and is on screen. Councillor Bain has a question. Councillor Bain.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Providing for the OCM, can the City please provide information in regard to how many shopping trolleys have been reported abandoned within the City in the last 24 months? Thank you.
Mr Burdett or Mr Mallon, are you able to answer that question, or would you prefer to take it on notice and provide a more comprehensive response?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. We'd take that on notice.
Are you okay with that, Councillor Bain? I think we'll have to take that on notice. Yeah. Any other questions in relation to that item, councillors? Councillor Ponaturo, yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just my question is in the public, the number one, the purpose of the proposed law is to provide regulation control. Does it apply to all the public or any residential events happening, or the public events in the places as well? or any communities, for any of the local communities.
Mr. Burdett?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Events are covered by the public building regulations, although this does contain requirements for stall holders and traders on public reserves.
Councillor Ponaturo?
Thank you. You mean during an event, they still hold the stalls and other stuff as well. So how do we actually educate them, and give this message even better way, a simplified way possible? Thank you.
Mr. Burdett?
Sure, thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, we actually have a simplified trading permit system that's only recently been set up. So there is a system currently in place for stall holders. This local law won't change that current process. It is very simple, been introduced in the last 12 months, which means a person that obtains a permit in Canning can then trade in neighbouring councils, and there's only one permit required. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Bain, you have another question?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My apologies. In addition to the previous question asked about shopping trolleys, would you be also able to provide information as to how many hours rangers have dedicated to responding to complaints about shopping trolleys? Thank you.
Is that something we might track, or at least give some sort of estimation or a guessometer? Mr. Mallon is coming to the lectern. Mr. Shane Mallon.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, we can definitely get the figures for reports over the last 24 months. The amount of hours dedicated by city staff over that period is almost impossible for me to report. Well, it is impossible for me to report, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the city will provide as much information as they can on that matter. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to SD 012 of 21, the title of the report being Proposed City of Canning Cat Local Law 2021. Councillor Spencer Teo. Yes, I saw your hand that time, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr.
Mayor. Fell off your chair.
I almost leaped at you. Anywho, it's rather confusing, and kudos to staff who can decipher these laws and what comes under the local law and what comes under the Act. But just a couple of questions with respect to cats being on leads in public open space. Would that be a provision under the local law or the Act?
The Act takes precedence, doesn't it? Could you just explain that? I think that was Councillor Spencer Teo's first question.
Yeah, thank you. Through Mr. Mayor. So anything in the local law can't be inconsistent with the Act. If it does, it's invalid. The Act would have to allow or have to give the local government the power to create a law to do with leashes for cats. We're of the understanding that there isn't the power in the Cat Act to create laws to do with leashes for cats. It's different to dogs. In the Dog Act, there's specific requirements for leashes or controlling dogs. Those provisions aren't reflected in the Cat Act.
Okay, and one more. Making bells mandatory on cats' collars, would that fall in the same category as there'd have to be a provision in the Act for us to do that?
Yeah, thank you. Through Mr. Mayor, yes, that's my understanding. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in relation to the cat law? Councillor Kunza?
I previously asked a similar question. So with respect to regulating cats, as in putting them on harness and leads, so what you're saying is that we wouldn't be able to make decisions on that, even though we wouldn't make provision for that, even though the Cat Act is under review right now. And if we endorse the local law, and then the updated Cat Act allows the provision of regulated cats, as in on lead, and then our local laws prohibit cats exercising in a whole number of local parks. Is that what you're saying?
Mr. Burdett?
Sorry, Councillor Kunza. I had an answer worked out and then it just dropped away.
So the Cat Act is under review. You stated that the current legislation does not allow the regulation of cats, as in cats on leads and taking them out into certain fields. Even though it's under review, we are prohibiting cats from going in certain... we are endorsing a local law which takes a long time to go through the process, and there's the potential that the new Cat Act will take into the consideration that a lot of people do have harnesses and cats on leads, and our local laws will prohibit the exercising of cats in these areas.
Yeah, so the cat local law has a list of prohibited areas. There's about 30 odd from memory. The Cat Act could be reviewed in the coming years. It could look to include provisions about controlling cats in a number of ways. The Cat Act currently doesn't have the powers for us to create a law about that particular issue of having cats on leashes. So it's not something that we could put in specifically. The Cat Act may be amended and it may have some related provision in that would then become mandatory across all of WA. So our local laws can't be inconsistent with the Act in any way. If they do, then it's invalid.
So when in the prohibitive areas, when you nominate a difference between bushland and parkland, I often see a person walking their cat through Adenia Park on a lead. That's an indoor cat that is only exercised by going through their local park. There's nothing in this local law that we would be able to do to enable the exercise of cats. Like, if they're not allowed out into that area, and we're not allowed to provide a provision to allow them to be on lead or anything. And so unless the cat legislation, the review of the Cat Act allows that to happen, cats can't be taken on leads in local parks, and so indoor cats need to potentially stay inside and not get exercised.
Mr. Burdett?
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, so if it was a site that's listed in the cat prohibited areas, then a cat couldn't be in there whether it's under effective control or not. So it can't be in there whatsoever. So absolutely it can't be in there.
Councillor Bain.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I refer to clause 4. I note the confusion amongst respondents as to the clarity of this clause dealing with nuisance cats. The definition of nuisance is at the beginning of the local law and includes no mention of roaming cats or cats attacking wildlife. Can the definition be moved down to clause 4 and also include cats that roam and attack wildlife as being a nuisance cat? Thank you.
Is that definition taken straight from the Act? Is that where the anomaly is?
Thank you, through Mr. Mayor. The definition is one that's been used by many local governments in their lawmaking. There was a couple of local governments that tried to introduce some additional clauses or sub-clauses in the definition of nuisance, which included the urination of a cat on a neighbour's property, those sorts of things. The Joint Standing Committee, which is a committee of Parliament, which when our laws are gazetted, it goes off to them for a final review. They made a decision to require that local government to change it back to the definition that you see in our draft. So councils have tried to clarify that, and the Parliamentary Committee has sought to retain that current definition. So we did look at that issue and have just kept with that definition. That's the accepted definition from the Joint Standing Committee. In terms of where it sits in the local law, it would currently sit where it is, but what we can do is do an administrative version of our local laws, and we can alter where that definition sits, which would be something that the public would see for their convenience. So we can, but we would make it clear that that's an admin version, different to what gets gazetted as the final law.
Councillor Bain.
Thank you for that. So I note that in some of the officers' responses, nuisance cats, well, the definition does include roaming cats, but you can't include the word roaming in the local law. Is that correct?
Mr. Burdett.
Yeah, yes, that's correct. Yeah, so there would be an operational, if you can imagine an officer dealing with a complaint to do with a nuisance cat, there would have to be an assessment made as to what constituted a nuisance, and they would factor in those sorts of things. It's just that that definition has to remain as is. Yeah.
Thank you, councillors. So we'll move on to the next item. Councillor Sweeney.
Yeah, I've just got one quick question through you, Mr. Mayor. Just on the enforcement of these, so I've got some clarity on how we're going to do this. how is that going to work? My first question is, how is the enforcement going to work? Are we going to respond to complaints when people ring up, or are we going to send a patrol out to find roaming cats? I just want some clarity on that. Thanks.
Mr. Mellon.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. Without preempting what the final local laws are going to look like, and there's still a long journey in the process, I guess it would be looking at our resources. Currently, we do respond to complaints regarding cats and dogs, and we also identify issues proactively when in the field. But it's probably a little bit early in the piece for me to answer exactly how we're going to tackle enforcement when we don't ultimately know what the final version of the local laws are going to look like.
Thank you, councillors. We'll move on now to report number SD 013 of 21. That's proposed City of Canning Animals Nuisance and Environmental Local Law. Any questions on that one? I've just got a question myself, if you don't mind on that. I'm just looking at clause 2.6, the conditions for keeping poultry. And we made some comment on that at some stage earlier, and I put a motion to council some time ago. Forgive me if I'm wrong. It says here under 2.6, a person who keeps poultry or permits poultry to be kept must ensure that B, no poultry are to be kept less than 6 metres from any dwelling house on any other lot. So I have a residential block that's 400 square metres, so sufficiently large to keep poultry, but the block is only 8.5 metres wide. And a lot of residential properties now with infill are less than or at about 10 metres wide from boundary to boundary. And also, of course, we allow at times for people to have parapet walls which form this, a wall of their home and actually sit on the boundary, which means it is absolutely impossible to keep poultry if you need to have them 6 metres from each home on either side of a 8.5 metre block. It's just impossible. Is that the intent of this?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The local law is set, is looking at some distances that we think are reasonable. There is a subsequent clause, and it's done deliberately. There's a subsequent clause which allows for an exemption to be issued to that clause. So in order to set some form of standard for the community, there needs to be some figure that we use that's consistent with what most local governments do.
I just wondered why the distance hadn't been considered from the boundary. So, for instance, and considering how many people have poultry, we've had that mentioned many times here. But why couldn't it have been no less than 2 metres from the fence line? So that would mean, regardless of how wide the A block is, and as I said, mine is 8.5 metres, that means it would be 2 metres from this boundary, 2 metres from that boundary, there would be 4.5 metres width and unlimited length that people could run a small chicken coop. But to make it 6 metres just seems to have no regard for what we are doing in relation to the infill program that we've committed to as a local government. So I don't understand it. I do take your point, just to finish here, in relation to exemptions, but the exemption is covered by section 2.9 on page 122 of the report. Now, the exemption has a number of conditions, and they say the application for exemption must include. It doesn't say may include, but it must include. And it must include D, proof of membership of a poultry or pigeon club, if applicable. So are you saying that to entertain a exemption, so if I was entertained considering having chickens in a closer than 6 metres, the only way to get an exemption would be if I was a member of a poultry club?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, it's not. It's primarily related to pigeons because there are people that are members of the association, but no, it's not. If it's applicable, if it's relevant, then that would be asked for.
I'm just wondering then, why would it say that it must include? I mean, this is unequivocal. It says it must include, proof of membership of a poultry or pigeon club. And there are poultry clubs, obviously. I mean, if we don't intend to enforce that, if that's not really a condition, why is it? I'm not understanding why it's in there. I do take your point in relation to the exemption process, but if councillors refer to page 122 and look at that process, which starts at item 4 and then goes all the way through to condition A, B, C, D, E, F and G, it's an extraordinary process for any person, and I'm talking about for the administration as well, simply to adjudicate on whether or not somebody can have 2 or 3 or 4 chickens in their backyard. It's just extraordinary to me. Can I just ask why we have such an onerous process when we're working so hard to reduce red tape? And in reference to a question you asked earlier, we're talking about these new universal licences we have in place to try and reduce red tape, but we've just put in place here an extraordinary process for the keeping of a couple of chooks. Mr. Burdett?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, the laws, what they do, in terms of our current laws, obviously, they're quite onerous. So unless you've got a block that's greater than 1,000 square metres, it's a prohibited area. This local law makes no mention of lot size. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the law needs to set some form of restriction. And that's what we've done. The exemption clause allows flexibility around that. But that's part of the challenge, is to set some reasonable standards by which people can meet. But if they can't, there is an application process that they can go through. It does look onerous.
It is onerous. I'd have to say it is onerous.
Well,
it hasn't been tested yet, but it's onerous.
Yeah, sure. Well, so there needs to be a process where somebody can apply, that can be considered, and the city can offer an approval if that's appropriate with conditions. There are many complaints that the city receives, and my department receives them, that relate to people not keeping poultry properly, manure piling up, flies, odour. Those are a very regular occurrence. So the law needs to set some standard, and if I can just quickly go back to the 6 metre requirement, is to try to provide some protection for the neighbour's dwelling, because that's where the odour is received. So that's why there's a 6 metre standard in there. But this is not an exact science, and we've tried to set some reasonable standards, allowing the flexibility for an exemption. That process would actually be set up online through our new system. So an application process would come in electronically, can be dealt with by the officer, and can be issued with conditions. So the law is making it, the way that it's structured, obviously, to be law and to be legal, and the words must and those sorts of things, they've got to be in there. But we don't see that as being an onerous process for the resident or for us to deal with it.
Can I just ask then, are you able, before the OCM, just to advise council of any council that's reviewed its poultry keeping local laws in the last 5 years that has a similar process and a exclusion zone of minimum 6 metres from adjoining neighbours on each side of the block? Are you able to advise that before next Tuesday's OCM?
Sure.
Yep. Can I also ask, are these local laws that are currently here before us in draft form, are these able to be further amended, or is council able to amend these, or?
Yes. So the recommendation is to advertise those for a period of 6 weeks. So there's opportunity to amend those.
By council or subject to community consultation?
Through community consultation. So there's opportunities for anybody to make submissions during that process.
Director Bride, can I refer to you? There was a motion to council which I put some time ago asking for, and the intent of the motion was about greater flexibility in relation to the keeping of poultry. And I guess we all knew at the time that the minimum block size of 1,000 square metres was one of a number of concerns, but it seems to have been the only one really that's changed. But now we've added, what it surely would be just as something just as onerous. There's 6 metres from each boundary with smaller lots.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, through Mr. Mayor, I think there's, as Mr. Burdett pointed out, The assertion is that a 6 metre setback to a neighbouring dwelling, and obviously we're worried about the protection of the amenity of the neighbouring dwelling, not the owner of the poultry. 6 metres, that assertion is there shouldn't be an odour impact or an amenity impact on the neighbour. So that's why if you're within that range, or if you're further away from that 6 metre setback, it's straight through without any issues whatsoever. No permits required. If you encroach on that 6 metres, then what we're saying is there's a permit process, and obviously we can provide a bit more details to our prediction of how many would potentially meet would be within the 6 metres and not. But certainly of those that are within that 6 metre threshold, there's a process that could be formulated with conditions to ensure that the neighbour's amenity is protected, and we can follow up on those conditions. So if there is a nuisance issue raised, we've got, I guess, a permit process. Certainly what council can do, so there's two opportunities. One is, as Mr Burdett pointed out, council can heed the community responses and agree to make changes. Obviously the concern would be if it's a significant change at that point, then we have to re-advertise the local law. If council between now and the OCM any councillor are looking at an alternate motion or an amendment, in this case, to maybe modify that 6 metres, for example, to a lesser number, but obviously we'll obviously do some research with other local governments as you've requested. That certainly can happen between now and the OCM. So certainly if a councillor has wishes to look at any amendment to the officer recommendation to put forward next Tuesday, we can certainly accommodate that in the meantime. But we'll do a bit of more research in relation to the 6 metres and get back to council in the OCM agenda.
Thank you, Director. And I don't want to get bogged down on this because I know we've got other things to do. Thank you. Sorry guys, just for a change, I might just... the other thing was 2.8, conditions for keeping aviary birds. I would think that half the homes in Willetton and every suburb of Canning would have an aviary. And they too, every home that has an aviary must be at least 6 metres from any dwelling on any other lot. So again, any person, and it doesn't specify what size aviary or how many birds, so an aviary can be, a small aviary with 3 or 4 budgies in it, but if the neighbours next door don't like the chirping of the budgies, then how do we accommodate on these blocks, on these smaller suburban blocks? 6 metres from each boundary, it's just impossible. And I'm wondering, I think my contention is that if somebody made a complaint, wouldn't we also investigate that? So if we didn't have the 6 metre rule, but somebody made a complaint, wouldn't the city investigate that in any case, if it was a nuisance complaint? That's my final question.
Through you, Mr Mayor, I think you raised an issue in terms of boundary walls. For example, if a garage wall is on the boundary, there's no human habitation in that particular structure. So these are the things that can definitely be considered. Obviously, generally houses have a rear setback. So if these particular structures were positioned towards the rear of the property, it does make that 6 metres a little bit more achievable, but I understand what you're saying in terms of the infill. In terms of whether we would follow up on any nuisance, regardless of whether it met the 6 metres, I might just defer to Mr Burdett on that one. Thank you.
Mr Burdett.
Sure, thank you through Mr Mayor. If that complaint related to odour or to noise, then it would be investigated. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, councillors, I know you think this is probably a poultry issue, but with an A. Deputy Mayor.
Just wanted to know with this, I think greater infill, is it possible that greater infill could lead to greater problems? And just to clarify, is the 6 metre, I think the 6 metres from the neighbour's house to, is my understanding correct that it's from the neighbour's house 6 metres to the poultry? It's not actually from the fence? Is that my understanding correct?
Mr Burdett, that's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, that's correct, yeah. Yep.
And,
yes, Deputy Mayor, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. So my understanding is that if it's greater than 6 metres and it's automatic, is there going to be some system like using maps or something that you say, okay, yep, all good? And if an exemption is granted, and this is similar to what the Mayor asked, but I just wanted to ask it anyway, if an exemption is granted, are you asking the neighbours around? Like, I know sometimes in some things, for example, with a pool, if you go too close to the neighbour's property, you've got to actually ask permission of the neighbour and do a little bit extra work. So, yeah, thanks.
Mr Burdett.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. So yes, there is, in the exemption clause, there is the ability to consult with the neighbour. Obviously, the one that's closest to that would be the one that's impacted. Yep.
Thank you, Councillor Ponaturo.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The poultry is very exciting compared to the budget. But just a quick question: what is our neighbouring council's rules? Are they similar or a bit more flexible? Thank you.
Thank you. I think Mr Burdett's going to come back to us with an answer on that, aren't you? Comparisons to...
I can do, yeah. Yeah. As an example, Gosnells is very, very similar. Yeah.
I'm more interested in asking the question earlier about not 20-year-old laws, but laws that have been reviewed in the last 5 years, for instance. Councillor Kunza?
Just through you, Mr Mayor, and following on from your last point with the aviary birds, I guess, and I don't speak for him, but I guess the question is, why do we prescribe a 6 metre distance with the aviaries, and I guess it applies to everything else, and then requiring exemptions instead of allowing, I guess, a bit more flexibility from the person's perspective, and then using nuisance provisions should it be too close to a neighbouring fence? Why are we basically assuming there's a problem on every one instead of responding to nuisance ones?
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
Mr Burdett?
Yeah, thank you through, Mr Mayor. I think the setting of the 6 metre is about that protection to that neighbour's dwelling, and we do get noise complaints to do with aviary birds, and having, from an enforcement point of view, from a legal point of view, to be able to have an aviary moved because it's sitting on a boundary and there's a neighbour bedroom a metre away, for example, is a lot easier than having to prove that the bird noise is breaching the noise regulations. It's a completely different legal set of evidence that we would need. So having one of the keys with laws is to try and keep them simple, and that's one of the ways to do it, is to have an arbitrary figure. It makes it a lot easier to enforce.
Councillor Barry.
Thank you. I'll ask this question on behalf of my girls. Is there, basically, because this is a significant one and it's going back, is there any other overriding legislature, like Local Government Act, Health Act, which the Joint Standing Committee or whoever this goes to will knock on the head anyway? And the other question then is that when we're talking about 6 metres and you've got 2 chooks, I mean, are we going to be in trouble for holding them like captive in the cages that everybody's complaining about, and we'll have Peter jumping over our fence and stealing our chooks?
Mr Burdett?
And I don't mean to be facetious, but...
Yeah, no, thank you through you, Mr Bear. It is possible that any of the clauses could be disallowed by the Joint Standing Committee. That's the natural process. These all go through that process. What we've done is tried to align the laws very much with councils that have had their laws reviewed recently and that have had no problems with the laws going through. So we don't envisage major issues. There could be some, but we don't envisage that there would be any. Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Kunza?
Just in regard to my last question, whilst I appreciate the response, is there not the potential to create a regulatory burden with a whole swath of people needing to seek exemptions for all these different, whether it be poultry, aviaries and that, to deal with, I don't know the facts and figures, how many complaints you get and how hard it is to prove it. But then my parents used to have aviary and it used to be on the adjacent fence. I don't think they ever received one complaint. And they would have been stunned to think that they would have to apply for an exemption and then go through that process. I'm just wondering, is it potentially a regulatory burden, getting all these people to apply for exemptions to fix an issue? I don't know how many people complain.
Mr Burdett?
Thank you, through Mr Mayor. Yeah, in my experience, practically how it plays out is that it comes up when there's complaints received, and that's how That's the time at which the law gets enforced, you might say. So it would be very unlikely for residents that have an aviary to realise that the laws are changing, and then they would have to apply for an exemption whilst there's education and the laws are publicly available. My experience is it's upon complaints when that comes in. The complaints relating to aviaries aren't significant at all, so it would come up through that process.
Thanks, Councillor. It's just been brought to my attention we have a number of people here for our next confidential item, and I've been sitting out there for a little while, so I apologise because I carried on a bit there, but we might just move on unless there's any pressing questions to 7.5, I think, is the next item, and that's already been brought forward. That was in relation to access and inclusion, so we've dealt with that matter. At 8, notices of motion for consideration. There are none. At urgent business, councillors, there are none. Confidential matters. Council will now consider confidential matters. I'd thank members of...
No, you missed 7.4.
I missed 7.4. Well, I'd like to keep moving as quickly as I can. Okay, just hang on just 1 second here. No, that's okay, I've got it. Yeah, you have to read my run sheet to understand why. It leads off with EN 00121 Shelley Beach Park. Anyway, EN 00221 request 15 to 2020 for community building refurbishment at 1 to 3 Hillview Place, Bentley. Councillor, you're moving that the matter is dealt with as a confidential matter?
Questions, your call.
Look, I don't have any issue with that. Let's deal with it as a confidential matter and let's just move on with it. Councillor Ponatore, issue? Can we? Thank you. We'll move on then. We shall move through the order. That matter, EN 002 of 21, will now be dealt with as a confidential matter.